The morning of June 3, 2013 arrived over Hong Kong with the kind of dense, subtropical heat that settles into a city not like weather but like a permanent condition, pressing against the skin, filling the lungs with moisture-laden air that carries the mingled scents of harbor brine, diesel exhaust, and the faint sweetness of tropical vegetation pushing through cracks in the pavement. Below the 31st floor of the Mira Hotel in the Kowloon district, the city moved with its customary relentless energy. Trams grinding along packed streets, ferries cutting white furrows across the harbor, market vendors arranging their stalls in the last cool hour before the day turned truly brutal. The skyline of Hong Kong Island caught the gray morning light and threw it back in fragments, hundreds of glass towers rising from the narrow strip of land between the hills and the water, the whole massive structure of the place humming with the low continuous frequency of commerce and motion that never quite stopped, not even in the deep hours of the night. The room was tidy in the impersonal way of good hotels. Egyptian cotton sheets pulled smooth, air conditioning maintaining a precise and slightly aggressive countertemperature to the heat pressing against the windows. A desk lamp throwing a circle of yellow light across a surface that held a laptop computer, 3 external hard drives, and a Rubik's Cube in its solved configuration, all its colored faces perfectly aligned. The man sitting at the desk had not slept much. He was 30 years old. He would turn 31 in 18 days, narrow-faced, with wire-rimmed glasses slightly too large for his features, a quality of careful stillness about him that was not the stillness of calm but of someone who has already finished the work of deciding and is now simply waiting for the consequences to arrive. He had been in this room for 2 weeks. He had told no one on earth where he was. His employer believed he was at a medical facility on the American mainland receiving treatment for a newly diagnosed epileptic condition. His girlfriend, a dancer named Lindsay Mills, was at their home on the island of Oahu going through the unremarkable routines of her life in the understanding that he would return in a matter of weeks. She was wrong, though she did not yet know it. By the time she understood how wrong, the truth would be publishing itself in newspapers across the world. His name was Edward Joseph Snowden, and the hard drives on that desk in that hotel room held approximately 1.5 million classified documents belonging to the National Security Agency of the United States of America. The number itself is almost too large to hold in the mind, 1.5 million individual files, each one stamped with classification markings that made their unauthorized removal a federal crime of the first order, each one describing some aspect of a surveillance infrastructure so broad and so deep that even those who had spent careers in the intelligence community and held the highest clearances did not necessarily know its full contours. Snowden had spent the better part of a year accumulating these documents with the systematic deliberateness of someone building an archive rather than merely preparing a leak. He had been selective in ways that would later be both praised and disputed. He had, by all accounts, read much of what he took. He understood what it meant. He had decided that the American public needed to understand it too, whether the law permitted that decision or not. Within 48 hours, the first of those documents would begin appearing in the pages of The Guardian, a British newspaper published from offices on King's Place in London. Within 72 hours, the phrase mass surveillance would be on the lips of commentators, politicians, and ordinary citizens in dozens of countries simultaneously. Within a week, his face and his voice would be known to every person on earth who consumed news in any medium. And within a month, the United States government would be engaged in a diplomatic effort of considerable urgency to retrieve him from a transit lounge at a Moscow airport, an effort that would ultimately fail, with consequences that are still unfolding today. None of that was certain yet in that hotel room on that gray morning. There was only the waiting. To understand how Edward Snowden arrived at that desk, you have to travel back well over 2,000 miles, to a small town on the northeastern coast of North Carolina called Elizabeth City, where he was born on June 21, 1983. Elizabeth City sits where the Pasquotank River meets the Albemarle Sound, a community of roughly 12,000 people that has accumulated very little of the kind of history that gets written down in national narratives. It is the sort of place where families have lived for several generations without any pressing reason to leave, where the pulse of daily life is set by the farming and fishing cycles, by school events and church calendars, by the rhythms of a community that understands itself primarily in local terms. The Snowden family would not remain there long. His father, Lon Snowden, was a career officer in the United States Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard, like all branches of the armed services, moved its people according to the needs of the institution rather than the preferences of the families attached to it. When Edward was still young, the family relocated to Maryland, specifically to a community in Anne Arundel County, not far from the town of Crofton, which sits in the suburban corridor that had grown up in the decades since World War II to house the vast population of federal employees, contractors, and military personnel required to keep the government of the world's most powerful nation running. It is, if you draw the geography carefully, one of the most consequential pieces of real estate in America while appearing entirely unremarkable from the outside. Fort Meade, the expansive military installation that serves as the headquarters of the National Security Agency, was close enough that its presence defined the local economics and, in quieter ways, the local psychology. People in that part of Maryland understood, without necessarily discussing it explicitly, that certain of their neighbors went to work each morning and could not say exactly what they did or where they did it. The secret world and the everyday world existed there not in opposition but in a kind of familiar proximity, like two households sharing a fence line. Snowden's mother, Wendy, worked as a clerk for the federal court system in Baltimore. His family was, in its basic orientation, a family of public servants, people who understood government employment as a respectable and purposeful way of spending a working life, who held the institutions of the American state in the kind of regard that comes not from naivety but from genuine participation. This was the atmosphere in which Edward Snowden was raised, modest, patriotic in the specific sense of people who actually staffed the enterprise of the Republic rather than merely theorized about it, close enough to the machinery of national security to understand that it existed and far enough from its classified interiors to hold it in uncomplicated respect. He was not a student who thrived within conventional academic structures. The testimony of people who knew him in his school years, and his own later accounts, describe a young man who found the pace and content of formal education poorly matched to how his mind actually worked. What absorbed him, with the totalizing focus that technically gifted children often develop toward the specific thing that will define their lives, was computers. He had grown up alongside the early commercial internet, experienced its expansion from university research tool to genuine social and commercial infrastructure during exactly the years when a young person's exposure to new technology leaves the deepest imprint. He was not merely competent with computers in the way that many young people of his generation were. He was, by his own account and by the account of people who later worked alongside him, exceptional with an instinct for how systems were built, how they could be navigated, how the architecture of a network implied things that its designers had not always intended to reveal. He dropped out of high school without completing his degree, continued taking courses at Anne Arundel Community College, and pursued his technical education with the self-directed intensity of someone who already knows where they are going, even if the road is not yet mapped. He read widely, not only in technical subjects but in political philosophy, in the history of American democracy, in the constitutional framework of the republic he had grown up in and whose institutions his family had served. He was, by the accounts of people who encountered him in those years, thoughtful and precise in his opinions, with a dry humor that carried better in text than in person, and a deep, almost reverent attachment to the principles expressed in the Bill of Rights. It was this attachment to a specific textual reading of what America was supposed to be that would form the through line of everything that followed. Not a career calculation, not a political affiliation, not the ideology of a traitor, as his government would later insist on calling it. A belief arrived at through reading and reflection and the formative experience of growing up in the shadow of the national security state without quite being inside it, that the promises embedded in the founding documents of the United States were real promises, binding promises, promises that the surveillance machinery he would one day walk directly into was quietly and systematically breaking. He did not know that yet, not specifically, not with the granular technical detail that a decade of classified access would provide. But the framework was already there, already forming, in the mind of a restless, technically gifted young man in a Maryland suburb who had not yet found a way to make the belief mean anything in practice. That would come. It would take a decade. It would take a path through the military, through the agencies, through the classified corridors of the most powerful intelligence apparatus in human history. And it would end in a hotel room in Hong Kong, with hard drives on a desk and a Rubik's Cube solved to perfection, waiting for a knock on the door. September 11, 2001 arrived in the northeastern United States as a morning of extraordinary clarity, the kind of transparent, high-pressure autumn day that meteorologists call severe clear. Not a cloud in the sky above New York or Washington or the Pennsylvania countryside, the light sharp and definitive as if the world had been brought into unusually precise focus. Edward Snowden was 18 years old, living with his family in their Maryland suburb, and like hundreds of millions of people in America and around the world, he watched what happened on television, the images repeating on every channel in a loop that seemed designed to confirm that what you were seeing was actually real and not some collective failure of the broadcast signal. The first tower, the second tower, the Pentagon, the field in Shanksville with its raw gouge in the earth. The whole catastrophe assembling itself in real time across a medium that existed, in ordinary circumstances, to maintain the comfortable fiction that the worst things happened somewhere else. The effect on Snowden was the effect that the attacks had on a generation of young Americans who reached adulthood in the months and years immediately following. A sudden, clarifying sense that the country required something from them, that the diffuse feeling of civic obligation that tends to hover at the edge of young consciousness without ever quite resolving into a specific demand had now resolved sharply and unmistakably. His country had been attacked. People had died in numbers that the mind resisted absorbing. The men who ran the government were talking about the need for sacrifice, for service, for people willing to put themselves between the Republic and those who wished it harm. Snowden believed them. More precisely, he believed the Republic they were invoking, the particular America of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the America of specific enforceable written guarantees, was genuinely worth defending, and that defending it was a real and serious thing that real and serious people did. He enlisted in the United States Army in 2004, when he was 20 years old. He applied not for a desk assignment or a support role but for the Special Forces program, which represented, then as now, one of the most demanding pathways into military service available to an enlisted man. The Special Forces selection process tests candidates across dimensions that have little to do with simple physical size or strength. Psychological stability under pressure, the capacity to function under conditions of prolonged sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion, the ability to learn quickly in chaotic environments, the kind of intelligence that organizes itself around problem-solving rather than rote retention. It is not the path chosen by people who want the easiest route through military service. It is the path chosen by people who want to do something that genuinely matters, and who believe they have the particular combination of attributes required to do it at the level the program demands. Snowden reported to Fort Benning in Georgia for training, and his military career ended there, before it had properly begun. The precise circumstances were described with some variation in different accounts Snowden gave over the following years. What is consistent across all versions is the result. He broke both legs during the training period. The most commonly cited account attributes this to a training accident involving a parachute exercise, and the injuries were serious enough to disqualify him from continuing. The Army discharged him on medical grounds, and he was returned to civilian life at 21 years old with a body that had failed the institution he had tried to enter, and the particular frustration of someone whose desire to serve had been genuine and whose opportunity to act on that desire had collapsed before he could test whether the desire would have held. The path that presented itself next was almost inevitable, given the geography of his life. Fort Meade was 15 miles from where he had grown up. The National Security Agency, headquartered on that installation behind multiple perimeter fences and badge access barriers and the kind of physical security measures that discourage the merely curious, was in the process of one of the most dramatic institutional expansions in its history. The attacks of September 11th had revealed, in the official accounting of what had gone wrong that morning, failures of intelligence sharing and analytical capacity that the agencies responsible for protecting the country would not be permitted to repeat. Congress was appropriating money. Contractors were being hired. The intelligence community was growing at a rate that required thousands of new cleared employees, and the particular kind of cleared employee it needed most urgently was the kind with technical skills. People who could build systems, manage networks, analyze data at scale, maintain the infrastructure of a surveillance enterprise that was being rebuilt and expanded almost simultaneously. The NSA needed people. Snowden could pass the polygraph, the background investigation, and the security clearance review. He had a family background in federal service. He had the technical skills. He was precisely the profile the agency's contractors were looking for, and precisely the kind of person who would find the proximity to classified work compelling in a way that a purely financial job opportunity would not have been. He applied for a position as a security guard at an NSA facility operated in conjunction with the University of Maryland Center for Advanced Study of Language, a research institution with a clearance requirement, an NSA connection, and a need for people willing to work the kind of hours that a government security position entails. He got the job. He passed the investigations, cleared the polygraph, received his credentials, and began showing up each morning to a workplace that existed, from the outside, as simply another institutional building on a university campus, and from the inside as a place where classified work was conducted behind locked doors and where the people walking around him held secrets they could not discuss outside the building. He was 22 years old. He was not yet anywhere near the classified work itself. He was standing in the lobby, checking badges. But he was inside the fence line, and that, in the world he was entering, was the crucial first coordinate. His intelligence and his technical abilities were not going unnoticed. The people who worked alongside him at that facility and later at other posts were, by his own account and by the account of supervisors who spoke about him in the years that followed, consistently struck by his capabilities. He moved through the lower tiers of agency-adjacent work with the speed of someone for whom the environment is not a challenge but a context, a place to apply existing ability rather than acquire new competencies from scratch. He studied for and obtained technical certifications. He demonstrated, in the practical daily work of information technology support in a classified environment, the kind of judgment and reliability that makes managers trust an employee with more responsibility and more access than the employee's formal position strictly requires. The Central Intelligence Agency noticed. Recruiting within the broader national security community is not always a formal process. It is sometimes a matter of the right person being seen doing good work in a visible enough place that the right opportunity eventually presents itself. In Snowden's case, the opportunity came in the form of a CIA position in information technology security, which he accepted in 2006. The CIA was a different world from the NSA not merely in mission but in culture, more human-focused, more oriented toward the specific business of running agents and collecting intelligence through personal contact rather than through the interception of electronic signals, with a different institutional personality and a different set of assumptions about how intelligence was gathered and used. Snowden was trained at the CIA's facility in Virginia, learned the specific tradecraft appropriate to his role, and was given, in the progression of access and responsibility that followed, a view of the intelligence world that the NSA security guard position had only gestured at. He was, by 2007, a certified CIA officer, not a field case officer in the romantic sense, not running sources in foreign capitals or managing networks of agents, but a technical specialist in information security with a full set of clearances and an institutional identity within the most powerful intelligence service on Earth. He was 23 years old and earning more money than his family had ever discussed as a realistic ambition, working on problems of genuine national significance, carrying in his breast pocket a credential that certified he was trusted by the government of the United States with information most of its citizens would never know existed. He believed genuinely in the value of the work. Whatever reservations were beginning to form at the edges of his thinking, and there is reason to believe they were beginning to form, that the gap between what the CIA said about itself and what it actually did was already visible to him at the margins, had not yet hardened into anything that would affect his performance or his commitment. He was still, in the only way that made sense at the time, a true believer. His next posting would begin to change that. In 2007, the CIA sent Edward Snowden to Geneva, Switzerland, under diplomatic cover. It was his first extended assignment abroad, his first sustained experience of the intelligence world as it actually operated rather than as it was described in the training materials and the frameworks of institutional purpose. Geneva, as a city, was something, a neutral ground where the machinery of international diplomacy had been running since the 19th century, where organizations with overlapping and sometimes contradictory mandates maintained their headquarters in gleaming buildings along the lake's western shore, where intelligence services from dozens of countries maintained presences that were, in the gentlemanly conventions of that particular city, understood to exist without necessarily being acknowledged. Snowden was there in an official capacity, supporting the CIA station's technical infrastructure, carrying a diplomatic passport that insulated him from certain of the local legal constraints that would otherwise have applied. What he saw there would begin, in quiet and incremental ways, to complicate his understanding of what he had signed up for. And the process of complication, once begun, was not something that would simply stop. Geneva in 2007 was precisely the kind of city that looks, from a certain comfortable distance, like the most civilized place on Earth. The lake that divides its two halves caught the light of the alpine sky and threw it back in shades of blue and gray and green that changed with every hour and every season. The jet d'eau, the enormous water fountain that the city had adopted as its unofficial emblem, sent its plume of white water 140 meters into the air above the lake and could be seen from almost any elevated point in the city, a gesture of extravagant calm that seemed to say, "Here, at least, things are orderly, things are managed. The worst impulses of nations have been contained and channeled into procedure." The United Nations European headquarters occupied its palatial building in the Ariana Park. The International Red Cross maintained its institutional presence nearby. The World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, the machinery of multilateral civilization had chosen Geneva as the place where its various gears would mesh, and the city had organized itself accordingly around the quiet industry of diplomacy, international banking, and the comfortable commerce that inevitably accompanies both. Snowden was 23, 24 while he was there. He was working as a technical specialist supporting the CIA station's information security infrastructure. Not the most glamorous posting in the agency's inventory of assignments, but one with genuine importance, since the digital security of a CIA station in a neutral city full of competing intelligence services was not a theoretical concern but a daily operational reality. He was good at the work. He had the natural aptitude and the focused attention to technical detail that made him the kind of IT officer that field personnel genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. He could solve problems, explain solutions without condescension, and maintain the kind of institutional reliability that kept the lights on in the most literal sense of what an intelligence station's technical infrastructure required. But Geneva was also a place where Snowden, for the first time, had sustained daily exposure to the culture of the intelligence world at the working level rather than the aspirational level of training films and orientation briefings. The people he worked with were not the patriots of institutional mythology, projecting restrained competence in service of democratic principles. They were, many of them, skilled and dedicated professionals doing genuinely important work. But they were also operators with pragmatic orientations toward their objectives that did not always produce behavior easily reconciled with the constitutional framework Snowden had grown up treating as the bedrock of what American power was supposed to mean. The episode that Snowden later cited most specifically in describing his growing disillusionment during the Geneva years involved a Swiss banker. The precise identity of the banker has never been publicly confirmed, and the account of what happened depended primarily on Snowden's own telling, which he gave in various forms after 2013. So it should be understood as his account of events rather than a documented and independently verified incident. What he described was a CIA effort to recruit the banker as an intelligence asset, an effort that involved getting the man intoxicated at a social event and then arranging, through contacts within local law enforcement, that he would be arrested for drunk driving on the way home. The plan, as Snowden understood it, was to allow the banker to experience the embarrassment and professional vulnerability of a criminal charge and then offer him a way out, in exchange, of course, for cooperation. A classic recruitment technique, arguably as old as intelligence work itself, and certainly not invented by the CIA. But in Snowden's telling, the experience of watching this operate in practice, of being close enough to the machinery of it to understand what was actually being done and why, produced something more than mere professional discomfort. There was a gap, and he could feel it clearly now, between the language the institution used about itself, the language of service, of constitutional constraint, of necessary sacrifice in the defense of democratic values, and the actual texture of the methods the institution deployed when it needed something that more straightforward approaches were not going to produce. He was not naive. He understood, intellectually, that intelligence agencies did not operate according to the same rules that governed civilian life. He had signed documents acknowledging the existence of methods and programs that could not be discussed outside secure facilities. He understood that the business of protecting a nation sometimes required actions that would look badly out of context. But understanding something intellectually and standing close enough to it to smell it are not the same experience, and whatever insulation the intellectual understanding had provided was beginning to thin. He left Geneva having seen more than he wanted to admit troubled him, and with a growing conviction, still unformed and not yet translating into any specific intention, that the questions being generated by his experience inside the intelligence community deserved serious consideration rather than the institutional suppression of doubt that cleared employees were culturally encouraged to practice. He left the CIA in 2009. He would later describe this decision in terms of the cumulative weight of what he had observed, though it is also fair to note that the transition from CIA employee to NSA contractor was not the kind of dramatic break it might appear in retrospect. The NSA contractor world offered better pay, interesting technical work, and access to problems at the cutting edge of what was, in 2009, a rapidly evolving domain. The decision was probably more complicated than any single explanation can capture. What is clear is that the next phase of his career would not lessen his concerns. It would multiply them systematically and comprehensively, until the questions he had been quietly assembling since Geneva could not be deferred any longer. He joined Dell, the technology company, which was at that time one of the NSA's largest contractors, providing technical personnel to support the agency's infrastructure at installations around the world. The contractor ecosystem that had grown up around the NSA and the broader intelligence community after 2001 was vast and, in certain respects, astonishing, a private sector workforce of cleared personnel that, in its scale and its pervasiveness, represented a structural transformation of how American intelligence actually functioned. The intelligence community had decided, in the urgent post-September 11 expansion, that augmenting its permanent workforce with contractors was the fastest way to acquire the technical and analytical capacity it needed. The decision made operational sense in the short term, and it created a long-term reality in which some of the most sensitive work performed by American intelligence was carried out by employees of private companies who could move between contractors, could change assignments, and could accumulate access that no single employer would have reason to question because each individual employer only saw the portion of the access that was relevant to their specific contract. Snowden went to Japan. The NSA maintained a significant presence at Yokosuka Air Base and at other installations in the country, and in the technical role he occupied there, he began working alongside some of the most capable and specialized people in the agency's orbit. Japan, in those years, meant proximity to East Asian signals intelligence targets of significant priority, Chinese military networks, North Korean communications infrastructure, the various electronic threads that ran through a region where American strategic interests were substantial and where the intelligence collection requirements were correspondingly extensive. Snowden was not purely a passive administrator of the systems involved in this work. His technical role gave him a window into the architecture of what the NSA was actually capable of doing, not in the abstract language of institutional mission statements, but in the granular technical reality of systems that could reach into networks and extract information with a precision that was, if you were technically literate enough to understand what you were looking at, genuinely extraordinary. He was beginning, in Japan, to understand the NSA at a different level of resolution than his previous employment had allowed. The agency was not merely a large organization that gathered foreign intelligence within defined legal boundaries. It was something considerably more expansive than that description suggested, an institution that had, in the decade since September 11th, rebuilt itself around technical collection capabilities of a scope and sophistication that the law governing intelligence collection had not been redesigned to account for, and that the oversight structures theoretically responsible for constraining it had, in various ways that Snowden was beginning to see, failed to understand well enough to constrain. Effectively, he was also becoming familiar with units and programs that did not appear anywhere in the public-facing descriptions of what the NSA did. The Office of Tailored Access Operations, known within the agency as TAO, was the NSA's elite offensive hacking unit, a group of specialists who broke into foreign computer networks, planted surveillance tools in target systems, developed custom malware capable of accessing specific systems that conventional collection methods could not reach, and in general prosecuted what the intelligence community called computer network exploitation at the highest possible technical level. TO's existence was not publicly acknowledged. Its work was classified at levels that put it beyond the knowledge of most people within the NSA itself. But in the technical environment Snowden moved through in Japan and later in other postings, its products and its methods were visible to people with the right access, and Snowden was acquiring access that, in retrospect, was more extensive than any single contractor assignment strictly required. He was 30 years old when he moved to the posting that would finally give him an unobstructed view of the system as a whole. The move took him from Asia to the Pacific, from Japan to the green hills and perpetual sunshine of the Hawaiian Islands, where the NSA maintained one of its most significant regional operations. He carried with him, by that point, more than 8 years of accumulated experience inside the classified world, enough to know what the questions were, enough to know that the answers to those questions were somewhere in the access that his new position would provide, and enough to know that he was going to look for them. The National Security Agency's Hawaii Regional Operations Center occupies a facility on the Kunia Plateau, inland from Pearl Harbor, set among the fields of red volcanic soil and the gently sloping hills that give the central part of Oahu a quality almost entirely different from the tourist-facing coastlines the island is famous for. The facility is embedded in a former pineapple plantation, its buildings low and deliberately inconspicuous, surrounded by perimeter fencing and the kind of controlled access infrastructure that communicates, to the occasional passerby on the road below, that whatever is happening inside is not intended for outside observation. The Hawaiian sky above it is frequently clear and very blue. The humidity rises off the surrounding fields in the afternoon heat. From the outside, nothing about the place announces itself as a node in the most sophisticated intelligence infrastructure ever assembled by a nation-state. From the inside, it was exactly that. Snowden arrived in Hawaii in March of 2013, having accepted a position with Booz Allen Hamilton, another of the major defense contractors that formed the permanent civilian workforce of the American intelligence community. The job title was Infrastructure Analyst. The practical reality of the position was something rather more consequential than that title would suggest to a civilian reader. Infrastructure Analyst, at the level of access Snowden occupied, meant working at the technical heart of the systems the NSA used to collect, process, store, and distribute intelligence, the pipes and storage vessels and sorting mechanisms through which an enormous and continuous river of intercepted data flowed. To work on the infrastructure was, in a meaningful technical sense, to have a view of the entire operation from the inside of its machinery. You could see not just what the system collected, but how the collection worked, what its legal authorities claimed to permit it, what its actual capabilities extended well beyond. Snowden had not taken this particular job by accident. This detail is important, and it was one he acknowledged directly in later interviews. He had sought out the Booz Allen position specifically because it would provide levels of access that his previous positions, however broadly scoped, had not offered. He had been accumulating evidence of what the NSA was doing piece by piece for the better part of 2 years before his arrival in Hawaii. The Hawaii assignment was, in his own telling, the final deliberate step toward getting close enough to the system to document it comprehensively. He had made a decision, or was in the final stages of making it, before he ever set foot in that facility. The access he was about to receive would not create his concerns. It would confirm them at a scale and with a specificity that removed the last possible excuse for doing nothing. He lived with Lindsay Mills in a comfortable house in a pleasant neighborhood on Oahu. By the accounts available of that period, the surface of daily life was ordinary, the kind of unremarkable domestic routine that accumulates around any couple in their late 20s living in a pleasant place and earning reasonably good money. Mills was a performer and an artist, active on social media, photographically documenting the landscape and the texture of Hawaiian life in a way that was public and expressive and entirely at odds with the interior life her partner was maintaining at that point. The contrast, in retrospect, is almost painful. She was posting photographs to her blog. He was downloading classified documents in a secure facility a few miles away. The account of exactly how Snowden copied the documents he ultimately took from the NSA is one that the agency contested vigorously in the years after 2013, and the specific technical mechanisms he used remain, in certain details, disputed or classified. What is broadly agreed, by Snowden himself, by intelligence officials, and by journalists who reported on the material, is that he used his legitimate system access to retrieve files that spanned an enormous range of classified programs, that he was systematic and deliberate in the scope of what he collected, and that the process took place over an extended period beginning well before he left for Hong Kong. He reportedly used the credentials of colleagues in addition to his own, a claim the NSA has made and Snowden has disputed in its characterization, with the agency alleging that he persuaded coworkers to share their login information under false pretenses. The full picture of how the collection was accomplished is one of the genuinely unresolved questions surrounding the Snowden case. What is not in dispute is what the documents described. And what they described, once Snowden had read and organized them, was a system so extensive and so carefully constructed to avoid public and congressional knowledge that it amounted, in his assessment, to a fundamental transformation of what the United States government was doing to the citizens it governed, conducted in secret, justified by legal interpretations that had been kept from the public, overseen by courts whose proceedings were classified, and expanded over the course of a decade, by successive administrations on the basis of authorities that no democratic public had been permitted to evaluate. The program that attracted the most immediate public attention when the documents were ultimately published was called PRISM. It had been operational since 2007 and involved the collection, under orders issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, of electronic communications from servers maintained by the major American technology companies. The list of companies whose data the NSA collected through PRISM was a directory of the Internet's most powerful institutions. Microsoft had been brought into the program in 2007, followed by Yahoo in 2008, Google and Facebook in 2009, Paltalk in 2009, YouTube in 2010, Skype and AOL in 2011, and Apple in 2012. The program allowed the NSA to collect, with a court order targeting a specific foreign intelligence subject, the emails, chat messages, file transfers, stored data, and real-time communications flowing through these companies' systems. The legal framework was Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, enacted in 2008, which permitted collection targeting foreigners outside the United States. The practical reality, which the documents made visible, was a collection system of extraordinary breadth that swept up communications involving American citizens, who were on the other end of the targeted exchanges, on a scale that the public language of targeted surveillance did not begin to suggest. Xkeyscore was different in character and in some respects even more striking. Where PRISM operated as a targeted collection program with at least a framework of individual court authorization, Xkeyscore was a tool for searching the river of intercepted internet traffic that the NSA collected through its other programs. It provided, according to the documents Snowden eventually shared with journalists, the ability to search through vast repositories of intercepted internet data, emails, search queries, websites visited, chat messages, using criteria as simple as an email address or a name or a geographic region. Internal NSA training materials, which appeared among the documents, claimed the system gave analysts the ability to read the contents of communications of targets around the world without additional legal authorization, accessing data that had already been collected under the agency's various authorities. The reach the system implied was staggering. The documents suggested that at its peak, Xkeyscore was processing data from over 150 sites around the world where NSA collection was conducted, and that through its search interface, an analyst with appropriate access could read the emails and track the online activity of individuals without seeking a court order specific to those individuals. The program, called Muscular, operated jointly with the British intelligence agency GCHQ, was in some ways the most viscerally shocking to the technology companies whose systems it affected. It worked not by going through the companies at all, but by tapping the private fiber optic cables that connected the data centers these companies maintained around the world. When data moved between a Google data center in Virginia and another Google data center in Ireland, it traveled along physical cables owned by Google that the companies had every reason to assume were private. Muscular involved covertly accessing those cables and copying the traffic flowing through them, inside what Google's own systems treated as its private internal network. Google's then executive chairman Eric Schmidt, when informed of this program, reportedly responded with a word that cannot be printed in a family publication. The diagram that appeared in one NSA internal document, a drawing of the link between the Yahoo and Google Cloud infrastructure, with a notation showing the collection point, accompanied by a small smiley face, became one of the most discussed and, in Silicon Valley circles, most furiously received images produced by Snowden's disclosures. Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act provided the legal authority for yet another program, and this one concerned not the content of communications but their metadata, the records of who called whom, when, for how long, from what location. The NSA, operating under court orders issued in secret by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, had been compelling Verizon and other major telecommunications companies to provide, on an ongoing and bulk basis, the telephone metadata records of essentially all their customers. Every call made on their networks, with all the associated identifying information except the content of the conversation itself. The program had been running since at least 2006. The theory was that even without the content of calls, the pattern of communications, who was in contact with whom, how often, in what sequence, in what proximity to specific events, could yield intelligence of value. The reality was a database of the telephone habits of essentially the entire American population, maintained in NSA systems, subject to limited oversight, and justified under a legal interpretation of the word relevant, that even members of the Senate Intelligence Committee who knew about it found difficult to defend publicly, because they were prohibited from discussing it. Snowden read all of this. He read the internal training documents and the legal memos and the operational plans and the oversight reports that told the institutional story, in the institution's own words, of what it believed it was authorized to do and what it was actually doing. And he arrived, through that reading, at a conclusion that would determine the rest of his life. That the gap between what the American government told its citizens about the scope of surveillance and what it was actually doing constituted not merely an oversight failure or a policy disagreement but a deliberate and systematic deception of the public and of elected representatives, conducted under the cover of classification, maintained by legal interpretations that no court but a secret court had ever evaluated, and expanding without meaningful check because the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to constrain it had been made structurally incapable of doing so. He was 30 years old. He had a high-paying job in a beautiful place. He had a partner who loved him and a life that, from the outside, had every outward element of the American success story his family's history had pointed toward. And he was sitting on what he believed to be evidence that the government of the United States was engaged in the most comprehensive surveillance of its own citizens in the nation's history, conducted in secret, justified by secret law, and defended by officials who appeared prepared to lie to Congress about its existence. The question that had been assembling itself for years had finally arrived, fully formed, demanding an answer. What was he going to do about it? The question of whether Snowden ever seriously considered using the official channels available to a cleared government employee who believes they have witnessed wrongdoing is one that was debated intensely in the years after 2013, and it is worth examining carefully rather than dismissing, because the answer illuminates something important about the structure of the system he was trying to expose. The legal framework for federal employees who discover and wish to report evidence of waste, fraud, or illegal activity is built around the concept of protected disclosures, communications to designated oversight bodies that the law is supposed to protect from retaliation. The Inspector General of the intelligence community existed precisely to receive this kind of report. The Congressional Intelligence Committees, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, had oversight responsibilities over the agencies whose classified program Snowden was concerned about. The Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act of 1998 provided specific procedures for cleared employees who believed they had discovered something that warranted congressional attention. Snowden later said, in interviews conducted from Moscow after 2013, that he had raised concerns through internal channels and had been rebuffed. The NSA disputed this characterization, producing limited records intended to suggest his internal communications did not constitute genuine whistleblowing attempts. The dispute between these two accounts was never fully adjudicated, partly because the relevant communications were themselves classified, and partly because the legal proceedings that might have produced such adjudication never occurred in the form that would allow a full public record to develop. What is largely agreed is this: Snowden did not file a formal Inspector General complaint, did not provide a protected disclosure to the Congressional Intelligence Committees through the procedures established for that purpose, and did not engage the most direct formal channels available to him before taking the approach he ultimately chose. His explanation for that omission was not, however, frivolous. To understand it, you have to understand what had happened to the previous person who tried the formal route. Thomas Andrews Drake was an NSA senior executive and decorated veteran who had worked at the agency for years and who, in the early 2000s, became alarmed by what he saw as waste, mismanagement, and illegal surveillance in the post-September 11 expansion of NSA programs. Drake chose every correct official channel. He went to the NSA Inspector General. He went to the Department of Defense Inspector General. He went to congressional oversight staff members. He documented his concerns carefully and provided them through the procedures designed to protect him. He believed the system would work because the system was supposed to work that way. What happened to Thomas Drake is a matter of public record. Federal agents raided his home in 2007. He was indicted in 2010 on 10 felony counts under the Espionage Act, facing a potential sentence of 35 years in federal prison. The charges against him were eventually reduced to a single misdemeanor, and he received no prison time, but only after years of legal proceedings that cost him his career, his savings, and his reputation in the community where he had spent his professional life. The Justice Department's pursuit of Drake became, for people inside the intelligence community who were watching, a highly visible demonstration of what official channels actually produced for cleared employees who attempted to use them. The message, whether it was intentionally sent that way or not, was clear. The formal protections existed on paper, and the institutional reality was substantially different. Snowden was aware of the Drake case. He mentioned it specifically in discussions with journalists after the revelations became public. He was also aware of John Kiriakou, the CIA officer who had been prosecuted and imprisoned for disclosing information about the agency's torture program. He was aware of the broader pattern in which the Obama administration had prosecuted more people under the Espionage Act for leaking classified information to journalists than all previous administrations combined, a statistical fact that had been reported and noted by civil liberties organizations and press freedom groups with considerable alarm. The pattern was not ambiguous for anyone paying attention to it. The system of official channels that was supposed to protect people who disclosed wrongdoing was, in practice, functioning most reliably as a mechanism to identify and punish them. There was another layer to Snowden's specific situation that made the official channel argument even harder to make in his case. The programs he was concerned about were not being conducted in secret from the congressional oversight committees. The members of the Senate Intelligence Committee with the highest level of clearances knew about the bulk collection programs. They had been briefed on PRISM. They had been given classified access to the legal interpretations supporting the programs. The oversight committees knew, and either endorsed what was happening or lacked the political will or procedural authority to stop it. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon was, by 2013, regularly making cryptic public statements warning that if the American public knew how the government was interpreting its surveillance authorities, they would be shocked. Statements carefully constructed to avoid disclosing classified information while signaling, loudly and clearly to anyone paying close attention, that something significant was being concealed. His warnings went largely unheeded, because without the specific facts that made the abstract warning concrete, the public had no means of evaluating what he was talking about. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISC, the secret court that authorized the collection programs under classified orders, was not functioning as an adversarial legal process. It was an 11-judge court that met in a secure facility, heard only the government side of each application, produced opinions that were themselves classified, and approved the overwhelming majority of government requests. In calendar year 2012, the court received 1,856 government applications for surveillance orders and rejected 0 of them. The court had produced, over the previous decade, a body of secret legal interpretation, secret law, in the plainest sense of the phrase, holding that surveillance of the type the NSA was conducting was authorized by statutes whose plain text the court was interpreting in ways that no member of the public, no independent judge in an open proceeding, and no member of Congress outside the classified briefing setting had ever had the opportunity to evaluate or challenge. Going to the FISC's oversight body with a complaint would have meant complaining to the court whose secret rulings he was specifically concerned about. Going to the intelligence committees would have meant going to the legislators who had been briefed on the programs and had not stopped them. Going to the inspector general would have meant going to an office within an institution that had a documented record of treating such reports as security threats rather than compliance opportunities. These were not abstract considerations. They were backed by specific, documented recent history. The safety valve in Snowden's assessment was not functioning, had not been functioning, and was not going to function for the kind of systemic concern he was carrying. One that was not about a discrete illegal act by an individual but about the institutional policy of the government of the United States, pursued in secret with the knowledge of some of its elected overseers and the studied ignorance of the public. He arrived at this conclusion not in a single moment of illumination but through a process that had been building for years, each new piece of evidence adding weight to a structure of concern that eventually became too heavy for any remaining professional or personal rationale to bear. The specific moment that many accounts identify as the breaking point came in March of 2013, when James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, the senior official in America's intelligence hierarchy, the man whose signature authorized the broadest classification decisions in the government, appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee and was asked a direct question. Senator Ron Wyden, who already knew the answer, had submitted the question in advance to give Clapper the opportunity to prepare a response, or to request that the exchange be moved to a classified setting. He asked, "Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?" James Clapper paused. He looked at the committee. He said, "No, sir." And then, as if the single word were not quite sufficient to the weight of the denial, he added, not wittingly. Snowden watched the exchange. He knew, with the specific technical knowledge of a person who had spent months with the actual classified documentation of the actual programs, that what Clapper had just told the United States Senate was false. The NSA was at that moment collecting the telephone metadata of essentially every American with a mobile phone, hundreds of millions of people, under Section 215 orders that Clapper's own office had authorized. The answer was not merely technically imprecise or careful in its lawyerly framing. It was a lie told to the Oversight Committee of the United States Senate, on the record in a public hearing, by the official most directly responsible for the truth or falsehood of the statement. Clapper later attempted to explain the remark by saying he had interpreted Wyden's question to be specifically about content collection rather than metadata, and that in the context of a public hearing he had tried to give the least untruthful answer available to him without disclosing classified programs. The phrase least untruthful entered the public record and stayed there, a distillation of the epistemic situation that Snowden had been documenting for months. Classified secrecy being used not merely to protect genuinely sensitive intelligence methods from foreign adversaries, but to prevent the government from being held to account by its own citizens for what it was doing in their name. Within days of that hearing, Snowden had reached a decision he would not revisit. The official channels were closed. The oversight structures were compromised. The public was being deliberately misled by the people constitutionally responsible for ensuring that it was not. He was not going to walk up the chain of command with a report. He was going to find journalists who could take what he had found and put it in front of the people it belonged to. Every person in America whose phone records were sitting in an NSA database, and every person around the world whose communications had been intercepted by an agency that had decided the boundaries of its authority were essentially whatever it could get away with claiming in a secret court proceeding. The plan had taken its final shape. What remained was the execution. Before Snowden could take any action, he needed to find the right people. This was not a simple problem. Leaking classified information to the wrong journalist, one who would approach the material carelessly, publish details that could genuinely endanger lives, or fail to understand the technical complexity of what was being handed to them, would not achieve what Snowden was trying to achieve. It might produce some headlines. it would probably produce his arrest. It would not produce the sustained, technically informed public examination of what the NSA was doing that the material in his assessment required. He needed journalists who were capable of holding the material with the same technical seriousness that had gone into collecting it, and who had the professional and legal infrastructure to publish it in a way that would survive the enormous pressure the United States government would immediately apply to prevent or discredit the disclosures. He had been thinking about this for some time before he acted on it. The journalist he identified first was not a reporter in the conventional sense, not someone who covered the intelligence community or national security policy for a major newspaper or wire service. She was a documentary filmmaker. Laura Poitras had been making films for most of her adult life, and by 2013 she had a particular history with the national security apparatus she would eventually help Snowden expose. Her 2006 documentary about the Iraq War, My Country, had been nominated for an Academy Award and had attracted the kind of official attention that drew her into the orbit of the surveillance state years before she knew it in those terms. Beginning in 2006, she had been detained and questioned at American airports each time she returned from abroad, dozens of times by her account, with her notes, her cameras, and her hard drives examined by federal agents who never explained their legal authority or their specific interest in her work. The pattern was consistent enough and systematic enough that press freedom organizations had taken up her cause, and the experience had given her both a personal reason to distrust the official accounting of what federal surveillance programs could and could not do, and a professional commitment to documenting national security overreach that was unambiguous in its motivation. In January of 2013, Poitras received an encrypted email from a sender she did not know, using the alias Citizen4. The email was cautious and abstract in its initial content, establishing a secure communications protocol before saying anything specific, asking Poitras to generate a particular kind of encryption key and communicate through a channel that would not be easily monitored. She was not certain at first what she was dealing with. People who worked in the territory where national security and journalism intersected received, with some regularity, communications from sources whose reliability and whose motives were equally unclear. But the person on the other end of this correspondence demonstrated, over subsequent exchanges, a specific and detailed technical knowledge of NSA systems that was not available from open-source research, and that could only have been acquired from inside the institution itself. He told her he was a senior official. He overstated his position initially, describing himself as having a higher rank than his actual employment status at the time, with access to information of significant public importance. He told her he intended to provide documents. He told her the information concerned programs that the public was being systematically deceived about. He told her that when he eventually came forward, he intended to do so openly under his own name, because he believed that anonymity would allow the government to characterize the disclosures as the work of a disgruntled or compromised insider rather than examining the substance of what was being disclosed. He also reached out, with Poitras's help, to Glenn Greenwald, a lawyer-turned-journalist who was writing a column on civil liberties and national security for The Guardian at the time from his home in Rio de Janeiro. Greenwald had spent years writing about the expansion of executive power and surveillance overreach in the post-September 11 era, building a readership that paid close attention to the legal frameworks and constitutional implications of counterterrorism policy that more mainstream reporters tended to treat as secondary to the operational stories. His work was polemical in tone and uncompromising in its willingness to challenge official government narratives, and his readership was exactly the group most likely to understand the significance of what Snowden intended to release. He was also, critically, not easily intimidated, a quality that would prove important in the weeks ahead. Initial contact with Greenwald was complicated by a practical obstacle that might, in other circumstances, have been merely funny. Greenwald did not use encrypted email and had not gotten around to setting up the tools Snowden required for secure communication, despite multiple requests from Snowden over the preceding weeks. The impasse was eventually resolved through Poitras, who had both the technical capability and the established secure channel with the source. Greenwald would later acknowledge, with a self-deprecating candor that was somewhat out of character for someone whose writing style did not typically traffic in self-deprecation, that his delay in adopting encryption technology had nearly cost him what would turn out to be the most significant journalistic scoop of the decade. Poitras and Greenwald eventually communicated with Snowden through secure channels and agreed to come to Hong Kong. The choice of Hong Kong as the meeting point was Snowden's, and it was not arbitrary. He had considered the options available to someone who needed a place to shelter while arranging the initial disclosures, and Hong Kong had specific attributes that made it, in his analysis, the most defensible choice. It was not the United States, and therefore removed from immediate American jurisdiction. It had an independent legal system, inherited from British rule and protected by the basic law that governed the Special Administrative Region after the 1997 handover, that provided meaningful procedural guarantees around extradition requests. Specifically, the requirement that any extradition be based on an offense that was criminal under Hong Kong law, as well as under the requesting country's law. It was a functional and open city, accessible by commercial air travel without the kind of elaborate entry procedures that might complicate a source's movements. And it was close enough to the mainland that the presence of Chinese sovereignty served, in his thinking, as a diplomatic counterweight to American pressure, though he was careful, at least publicly, to say that he had no intention of providing any information to the Chinese government. Ewan MacAskill, the Guardian's veteran intelligence and security correspondent, was added to the team to provide the institutional credibility and sourcing rigor that a story of this magnitude would require. MacAskill had spent years covering the intelligence community for The Guardian and brought to the meeting a journalist's practiced skepticism about source motives and document reliability that complemented Greenwald's commitment to the civil liberties implications and Poitras's filmmaker attention to visual and human detail. In Hawaii, during the final weeks before his departure, Snowden was performing a version of normal life while simultaneously engaged in a series of preparations whose implications he understood entirely and whose costs he had, by his own accounting, accepted. He made arrangements for the handling of certain of his affairs without explaining why such arrangements were necessary. He spoke with Lindsay Mills in ways that suggested, to anyone who later looked back at those conversations with the knowledge of what was coming, the careful omissions of a person who is protecting someone they love from information that would only make their position worse. He told his employer, Booz Allen Hamilton, that he needed medical leave to seek treatment for epilepsy, a condition he apparently had discussed in the past, and which provided a plausible reason for an extended absence. He went to work in the days before his departure and performed his duties without visible irregularity. People who saw him in those final days reported nothing that struck them at the time as unusual. On May 20, 2013, he drove to Honolulu International Airport with a small amount of luggage and the hard drives, and he boarded a commercial flight. He was 30 years old. He was leaving behind a six-figure salary, a comfortable house, a partner who did not know what was happening, and the country whose institutions he had served for a decade. He was carrying what may have been the largest collection of classified American intelligence documents ever removed from government custody by a single individual. He was flying to a city he had never lived in, to meet journalists he had never spoken to in person, to begin a process that he understood, with total clarity, could end in a federal prison cell. The plane banked over the ocean, and the green slopes of Oahu fell away behind it, and the Pacific stretched out ahead, enormous and featureless and bright. Hong Kong received him with no particular fanfare. The immigration officer at Chek Lap Kok Airport processed his American passport with the routine impersonality of a city that handles millions of international arrivals each year. Its airport one of the busiest transit points in Asia, its procedures calibrated for throughput rather than scrutiny. He collected his bags. He passed through customs. He stepped out into the arrival hall of an international airport in a Chinese special administrative region, carrying documents that represented, if his analysis was correct, one of the most significant security breaches in American intelligence history, and the city received him the way it received everyone, indifferently, efficiently, and without interest in his particular story. He took a taxi to the Mira Hotel in Kowloon, on Nathan Road, in the dense commercial district on the mainland side of the harbor. The Mira was not the kind of hotel that aimed at invisibility. It was a modern boutique property with design sensibility expressed in every surface, the kind of place favored by young professionals and creative industry travelers who wanted something more interesting than the anonymous luxury of the major chains. But it was respectable and discreet, and it offered the practical feature of being entirely normal for a traveling American professional to be staying in. He paid in cash where possible. He checked in under his own name because traveling under a false name was not something his situation permitted. He was not, after all, a spy in the operational sense, carrying a fabricated identity. He was an American citizen in a foreign city, doing something that would shortly become illegal the moment the first headline was published, and which was not yet illegal at all. The room was a reasonable size with a view that looked out over the dense vertical compression of Kowloon's built environment. Towers stacked against towers, the hillside rising behind the commercial district, the harbor visible in the small distance through gaps between buildings. He set up his equipment carefully. He organized the hard drives. He reviewed the documents he intended to give the journalists and considered again the sequence of disclosures, what should come first and in what order, which programs were most immediately comprehensible to a general readership and which required more technical preparation before they could be made intelligible without inadvertently misleading. He had thought about this for months. The thinking was done. The execution was what remained. The arrangement for the journalists to find him was a piece of tradecraft that Snowden had devised with the practical creativity of someone who had spent a career thinking about operational security. Poitras and Greenwald would come to the hotel. They would go to a specific location in the lobby. They would look for a man carrying a Rubik's Cube. The specificity of the identifier, not a newspaper under the arm, not a particular colored jacket, but a Rubik's Cube solved and carried visibly, had a practical logic. It was distinctive enough to be immediately identifiable without being so unusual as to draw attention in a hotel lobby where someone carrying an interesting toy would merely seem eccentric. Snowden had been solving Rubik's Cubes since his teenage years, in the way that a certain kind of technical mind finds the pure, closed puzzle of the cube satisfying in its completeness. It was the kind of detail that, once you knew it, made Snowden feel more recognizable as a person rather than less. The NSA contractor who liked Rubik's Cubes, who had grown up near the most secretive intelligence facility on Earth and had ended up inside it, and who was now sitting in a Hong Kong hotel lobby working through a color sequence while waiting for two journalists who were going to help him change the world. The meetings that followed over the next several days were, by the accounts of everyone present, extraordinary in their intensity and their content. Poitras was filming. She had been documenting the operation from the beginning, building what would eventually become the Academy Award-winning documentary Citizen4. Greenwald was taking notes with the focused, rapid-fire processing of a journalist who recognizes, in real time, that he is in the presence of something genuinely historic. McCaskill was assessing, applying the professional skepticism of a veteran reporter who has encountered many people claiming access to significant material and has learned to reserve judgment until the material itself demonstrates its validity. What the material demonstrated, as Snowden walked the journalists through the documents over the course of those sessions, was more than adequate to remove any reasonable doubt. The documents were classified. They were internally consistent. They bore the specific technical details, program names, code names, collection systems, legal authorities, organizational charts, that only someone with genuine access to the NSA's classified internal systems could have assembled. They showed, in the NSA's own words, what the NSA was doing, the scope of PRISM, the architecture of XKeyscore, the legal framework of the Section 215 bulk collection program, the extent to which American technology companies had been incorporated, whether wholly voluntarily or under legal compulsion, into a surveillance architecture of unprecedented scale. Greenwald later described sitting in that hotel room and listening to Snowden explain what was in the documents with the particular quality of someone who had been living inside this material for months and had achieved a level of command over it that went far beyond simple familiarity. Snowden did not merely know what the documents said. He understood their implications, could explain the technical mechanisms in accessible terms, could anticipate the objections and the contextual questions, and could describe the legal framework with the precision of someone who had read both the classified documents and the public statutes and understood exactly where the gap between the two resided. He was, in Greenwald's account, one of the most impressive and well-prepared sources the journalist had encountered in a career that had included a great many of them. McCaskill's assessment was more measured in its initial expression, which was appropriate. He was the journalist at the table whose specific professional responsibility was exactly the skepticism that Greenwald and Poitras, both of whom were already substantially convinced, might not be fully exercising. McCaskill spent those first sessions watching Snowden with the quiet attentiveness of someone taking a careful measurement. He was trying to determine, in the way that experienced intelligence reporters develop an instinct for, whether what he was seeing was genuine, whether this was a real insider with genuine documents and comprehensible motives, or some more complicated arrangement whose full dimensions were not yet visible. He concluded it was the former. The documents were real. The man was who he said he was. The story was real. His report to Alan Rusbridger, the Guardian's editor in London, was one sentence. The documents are real and the source is genuine. Snowden was maintaining, during those days, a kind of deliberate composure that everyone who was present later remarked upon. He was not, in the rooms where the meetings occurred, nervous in the ways that people under the kind of pressure he was under tend to display nervousness. He had done the thinking. He had made the decision. The uncertainty that generates anxiety had been resolved, not by the elimination of risk but by the acceptance of it. He knew what was likely to happen to him. He had worked through the scenarios. He understood that his life, as it had been organized and lived for the previous decade, was over, that the salary, the clearances, the respectable professional identity of a national security contractor, the life on Oahu with Lindsay Mills, the simple freedom of being a person who could get on a plane and go home, all of it had been placed on the other side of the decision he had already made. He ate at the hotel. He watched news on the television. He solved Rubik's Cubes. He briefed journalists on the architecture of global surveillance. He waited. But if you are finding this story as gripping as we do, the weight of these days, the impossible precision with which one man calculated the cost of truth against the comfort of staying silent, we would love for you to be part of the conversation. Make sure to subscribe to The Dead Drop so you never miss our deep dives into the most extraordinary espionage stories in modern history. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. It genuinely helps us continue bringing these stories to you. The journalists returned to their respective cities to prepare their stories for publication. Greenwald flew to Rio de Janeiro. McCaskill returned to London and the Guardian's offices on King's Place. Poitras remained in contact with Snowden through their encrypted channel, continuing to document what was happening. In London, Guardian editors Alan Rusbridger and Janine Gibson were in consultation with the newspaper's lawyers about the legal exposure of publication, the procedures for protecting source identity, and the journalistic standards that would need to be applied to material of this classification level. The Washington Post had also been given a portion of the documents, specifically the PRISM-related material, through a separate channel, and its editors were going through their own internal deliberations about how and whether to publish. The United States government had no knowledge at this point that publication was imminent. The NSA was not in a condition of alert. The CIA was not looking for a contractor in a Hong Kong hotel room. The full weight of the American national security apparatus, the most powerful intelligence machine in human history, with global collection capabilities, thousands of professional analysts, and the resources of the most powerful government on Earth, was not yet pointed in Edward Snowden's direction. In a few days it would be. But for now, there was only the hotel and the documents, and the journalists flying to their offices to write the stories that would change everything. The first story was published on the evening of Wednesday, June 5, 2013, on the Guardian's website. It was not, in its immediate subject matter, the most dramatic of what was coming. It concerned a court order requiring Verizon, the telecommunications company, to hand over the telephone metadata records of all its American customers on an ongoing, daily basis. No names were in the story, no conversations, no content. What it described was the framework of a secret court order and the category of information being collected. Who called whom, when, for how long, from what location, how often. Metadata. The word felt almost mild when you said it, bureaucratic and technical in a way that didn't seem, at first reading, to convey the weight of what was actually being revealed. But the Guardian had the actual document. They published it. It was a classified order issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court on April 25, 2013, addressed to Verizon Business Network Services, commanding the company to provide to the NSA, on an ongoing daily basis, all call detail records, defined to include any telephony metadata, which was defined in turn to include the numbers of both parties on a call, the unique identifiers for each device involved, the date, time, duration, and routing information for any call made through Verizon's network. The order covered all call detail records or telephony metadata created by Verizon for communications between the United States and abroad, or wholly within the United States, including local telephone calls. The United States wholly, including local calls, not targeted at a suspected terrorist, not associated with a specific investigation. All of them, every one. The White House issued a statement that night saying the program was lawful, that it had been renewed by the appropriate court, that it was subject to oversight by all three branches of government, and that published news reports about it contained inaccuracies it would not specify. The NSA declined to comment in detail. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence said the collection program was a critical tool for protecting the nation from terrorism and that the information had proven valuable in that regard, without providing specific examples because providing specific examples would require confirmation of classified operational details. In the 24 hours between the Verizon story and the second story, something happened to the American public conversation that the government statement that night was powerless to prevent. The first story's immediate impact was significant. It produced a sharp and genuine shock in the readership that encountered it, which was large, because The Guardian in 2013 had an American readership of several million monthly visitors, and the Verizon story moved through social media at a pace that the traditional news cycle had not anticipated. People read it. They understood it. They checked whether they were Verizon customers. Many of them were. On the morning of June 6th, The Guardian and The Washington Post published simultaneously. The story was PRISM. The Washington Post's coverage was based on the same underlying documents that The Guardian was working from, provided through a separate channel to Post reporter Barton Gellman, whose relationship with Snowden had developed independently of the Greenwald and Poitras collaboration. The two newspapers' publication of the same program on the same morning was not, precisely speaking, coordinated. Both organizations had made their own independent editorial decisions about timing, but the simultaneous appearance of the story in both major outlets gave it an authority and a reach that neither publication could have achieved alone. This was not a single journalist's eccentric interpretation of an ambiguous document. It was two of the most significant news organizations in the English-speaking world reporting the same thing from the same documentary evidence. The story described a program called PRISM that had been operating since 2007 under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which allowed the NSA to collect, from servers maintained by American technology companies operating under court orders from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the internet communications of non-American persons located outside the United States. The program's listed participants, laid out in the documents in a sequence showing when each company had joined the collection framework, read like a directory of the internet itself. Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, Apple. The reaction in the technology industry was immediate and furious. Google issued a statement within hours saying the company did not provide the government with direct access to its servers, that they carefully scrutinize any government request and vigorously challenge requests that do not conform to applicable laws, that the total number and nature of requests were a matter of public record in their transparency reports, and that they had not joined any program providing the kind of access the news reports described. Facebook made nearly identical statements. Apple's statement was similar. Microsoft said it provided customer data to governments only when legally required to do so and did not provide that access voluntarily. The government's response to PRISM was more substantive than its response to the Verizon story had been, because the program was structurally different in ways that required more elaborate defense. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper declassified, on the Friday after publication, a description of the PRISM program that confirmed its existence while characterizing it in terms considerably more benign than the documents suggested were accurate. He acknowledged that the NSA collected information under Section 702. He said the program targeted only non-Americans outside the United States and that it was subject to extensive oversight. He did not address the fact that the collection necessarily swept up communications involving Americans, which was the element of the program that the documents had most vividly illustrated. He did not address the previous week's assertion to the Senate Intelligence Committee that the NSA did not collect data on millions of Americans, which the Verizon order had already documented as false. President Obama, at a press conference, said that every member of Congress had been briefed on the relevant programs, that there were appropriate checks and balances in place, and that Americans should be reassured that no one was listening to their telephone calls. The last assertion was technically true. The metadata program collected records of calls, not content. But in the context of a week in which it had been established that the NSA was conducting surveillance on a scale that most Americans had not understood was legal, much less operational, the reassurance fell somewhat short of reassuring. The stories had not yet revealed where they came from. The source was still anonymous. The journalists at The Guardian and The Washington Post were protecting Snowden's identity, while the first publications established the documentary basis for the broader story. The public was consuming an extraordinary and disorienting series of revelations about surveillance programs it had not known existed, conducted under legal authorities it had not known were being deployed in this manner, and in the absence of a face or a name attached to the source, the conversation was still largely about the programs themselves. That was about to change. 3 days after the PRISM story, on Sunday, June 9th, The Guardian published a 12-minute video on its website. The video had been filmed by Laura Poitras in the Mira Hotel. In it, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses sat in a hotel room chair and explained, in a measured, conversational, technically precise voice, who he was, what he had done, and why he had done it. He was 30 years old. He had worked for the NSA and the CIA. He had, he said, the ability to wiretap anyone in the world, from a federal judge to the President of the United States, if he had a personal email address. And he had decided that the power to do that, and the exercise of a far broader version of it by the institution he had left, was something the public needed to know about regardless of what it cost him. His name, he said clearly and without hesitation, was Edward Joseph Snowden. The world went still for a moment, the way it occasionally does when something genuinely unexpected arrives. The reaction to Snowden's self-identification was immediate and extraordinarily varied, which was itself a kind of measure of how deeply the revelations had already disturbed established frameworks for thinking about national security, privacy, and the obligations of the state to the people it governed. Within hours of The Guardian video going live on June 9, 2013, Snowden was simultaneously being described in the same news cycle, in the same publications, sometimes in the same conversation, as a hero and a traitor, a whistleblower and a spy, a patriot and a criminal. The range of responses was not merely the predictable polarization of a media landscape accustomed to finding two sides to every story. It reflected a genuine and deep disagreement about questions that had been suppressed, avoided, or kept artificially contained inside classified briefing rooms for the previous dozen years, and which now had a specific person's face attached to them and therefore could no longer be entirely abstract. The intelligence community's response was visceral and swift. Current and former officials who went on the record in the hours and days after Snowden identified himself deployed language of the kind typically reserved for the most serious betrayals of national security. Representative Peter King of New York, who sat on the House Intelligence Committee, called for Snowden's extradition and prosecution. Representative Mike Rogers, the House Intelligence Committee chairman, said Snowden had committed treason. A former NSA director, Michael Hayden, who had also led the CIA, said Snowden's actions had caused serious damage to American intelligence capabilities. Former Vice President Dick Cheney, making a television appearance on Fox News, called Snowden a traitor and suggested the possibility that he was working for China, noting pointedly that he had chosen to go to Hong Kong. The characterization of Snowden as a traitor, a specific and loaded word with a specific legal meaning under Article 3 of the Constitution, was being deployed in these early days with a confidence that outran the evidence available for it, since there was no documented assertion, then or subsequently, that Snowden had provided information to any foreign intelligence service. The public reaction was more complicated and, on balance, considerably more favorable to Snowden than official Washington seemed prepared for. Polling conducted in the week following the revelations found that a majority of Americans supported Snowden's decision to make the information public, with roughly 54% of respondents in one survey saying they believed the disclosure served the public interest. Further, a significant plurality, depending on the poll, ranging from around 40 to over 50%, said they thought the NSA's surveillance programs had gone too far. These were not the numbers of a nation unanimously behind its intelligence community's public characterization of the leaker as a dangerous traitor. They were the numbers of a public whose relationship with its government's surveillance activities had been, by a young man in a hotel room in Hong Kong, permanently altered. The civil liberties organizations that had been fighting NSA surveillance in courts and in public advocacy for years responded with a mixture of vindication and alarm. Vindication because the documents confirmed precisely the programs they had been trying to challenge on the basis of circumstantial and inferential evidence, and alarm because the scope of what was confirmed exceeded even their most expansive estimates. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a legal challenge to the Section 215 bulk collection program within days of the Verizon story, now armed with the actual classified order instead of the theoretical arguments they had previously been limited to. The Electronic Frontier Foundation intensified legal proceedings it had been conducting for years. Attorneys who had been suing the government on behalf of surveillance subjects for whom they previously had no way to obtain standing, because classification prevented the government from confirming any specific person had been surveilled, suddenly had documentary evidence that could potentially be used to establish the legal basis their cases had lacked. The journalists involved were experiencing something that sat at the intersection of professional achievement and personal legal exposure that made for deeply uncomfortable navigation. The Obama administration had charged more people under the Espionage Act than all previous administrations combined. The legal framework for prosecuting journalists who published classified information was disputed and uncertain but had never been conclusively closed off. The Guardian's editors were consulting lawyers around the clock. So were the Washington Post's. In the United Kingdom, the Government Communications Headquarters, the British Signals Intelligence Agency functionally equivalent to the NSA, whose programs had also been partially revealed in the Snowden documents, was making its displeasure known to British media through official channels and through the informal pressure that the British government had historically been better than most at exerting on the national press. The diplomatic dimension was also developing rapidly. The United States had been operating surveillance programs that extended well beyond any plausible definition of targeting foreign threats, programs that collected data on the communications infrastructure of allied nations and, as would emerge in subsequent disclosures, on the communications of allied heads of government. The full diplomatic storm was not yet visible in that first week, but its preconditions were being established with every new document published. Information that would eventually require the American ambassador to Germany to be summoned for an official explanation, that would cause the Brazilian president to cancel a state visit to Washington, that would trigger an emergency session of the European Parliament, was sitting in organized folders on hard drives that were now in the hands of journalists who had every professional motivation to continue publishing. In the Mira Hotel, Snowden had been aware that his position was becoming untenable from a legal standpoint from the moment the first story went live. His anonymity had bought a few days of protection, but his identification in the June 9th video ended that entirely. The American government now knew who had taken the documents. The process of responding through legal, diplomatic, and intelligence channels was already in motion. He was still in Hong Kong, which was still technically territory under Chinese sovereignty, and the immediate American diplomatic pressure to have him detained and extradited was building with a speed commensurate with the seriousness with which official Washington was treating the situation. He engaged lawyers in Hong Kong. He gave interviews to journalists, including a live web chat with Guardian readers that produced a remarkable and direct transcript, in which he answered public questions with the same calm precision that had characterized his sessions with Greenwald and Poitras. He said he had not provided any information to the Chinese government and had no intention of doing so. He said he had chosen Hong Kong partly for its history as a place where political dissidents had sought and received protection. He said he did not fear for his own safety specifically because he had been careful, before leaving Hawaii, to ensure that the documents he had provided to journalists were not the full scope of what he had taken, that he had been strategic about what was in whose hands, and that any attempt to harm or coerce him would not prevent continued publication. The government of Hong Kong, for its part, moved with a deliberateness that served, in effect, to give Snowden more time than a faster-moving administration might have permitted. Hong Kong's official position was that any extradition request from the United States would need to be submitted through proper legal channels and would be evaluated on its merits under Hong Kong law. The proper legal channels were understood to take time. The American government did submit an extradition request, but its submission was identified as technically deficient by Hong Kong authorities. The documentation, Hong Kong officials noted, contained inconsistencies regarding the description of the alleged offenses, and the processing delay this created was significant. The clock was running. Snowden knew it. His lawyers knew it. And the people who had been quietly working in parallel to the journalists and the lawyers to help him find somewhere else to go understood it most clearly of all. The people working to help Snowden relocate were not primarily lawyers or diplomats. The principal figure in organizing his departure from Hong Kong was an Australian whose relationship to state power was, to say the least, already defined by adversarial experience. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, had been living since December of 2010 in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, a small diplomatic mission in the Knightsbridge neighborhood, in a building attached to a hairdresser's shop on Hans Crescent, where he had taken refuge after the United Kingdom concluded an extradition agreement with Sweden that would, in his reading, eventually deliver him to Swedish prosecutors investigating sexual assault allegations. WikiLeaks had achieved, before Snowden had ever contacted a journalist, a particular and controversial prominence in the world of classified document publication. The organization had published the State Department cables provided by Chelsea Manning, the video from the 2007 Baghdad helicopter attack that Manning had also provided, and a volume of classified military material whose publication had generated the same range of official responses. Heroic transparency on one side, dangerous treason. On the other, that Snowden's disclosures were now producing. Assange and Snowden were not natural allies in most respects. Their assessments of each other have been documented as cautious rather than enthusiastic, and there were people in Snowden's orbit who were genuinely concerned about the association's effect on how Snowden's own disclosures would be perceived. WikiLeaks carried, by 2013, an ideological reputation that some civil libertarians found useful and others found excessively polemical, and the question of whether being associated with the organization would help or harm Snowden's public standing was not a trivial one. But practical considerations had a way of concentrating the question. WikiLeaks had experience navigating the diplomatic and legal challenges involved in providing assistance to people the American government was seeking to detain. They had a lawyer named Sarah Harrison who was both capable and personally courageous. And Assange, operating from his London embassy confinement, had a motivation to assist someone in Snowden's situation that did not require any deep ideological alignment to be entirely real and reliable. It was Harrison who flew to Hong Kong to accompany Snowden on the journey that departing from Hong Kong required. The arrangement for his exit had its own operational complexity. Snowden needed to get from the hotel, through Hong Kong's airport, and onto an aircraft to a destination that was not the United States, and he needed to do this while the American government was actively attempting to prevent exactly that movement. The passport question was central. His American passport was still valid as of his departure from Hong Kong on June 23. The United States would revoke it the following day, in a decision that would create its own significant complications, but the act of traveling on it was itself a potential trigger for the customs and immigration systems of any country that might be monitoring for his movement at American request. The route he took was Russia. Specifically, an Aeroflot flight from Hong Kong's Czech Lapkok Airport to Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow. The formal, intended destination was not Russia. Figures associated with WikiLeaks and accounts from various journalists who reported on this period described an initial plan to transit through Moscow and continue to Ecuador, which had been approached about providing asylum and had appeared receptive through its foreign minister. The Ecuadorian government of Rafael Correa had a documented record of being willing to offer asylum to individuals whom the American government wanted to prosecute, Assange himself being the most prominent example, and the diplomatic transaction involved in granting Snowden refuge in a South American country with strong leftist credentials and no extradition treaty with the United States had a political logic that was straightforwardly visible. The aircraft landed at Sheremetyevo at approximately 5 in the morning on June 23, Moscow time. Snowden was aboard. Sarah Harrison was with him. The seat in which he would have continued a connecting flight to Cuba, and eventually to Quito, was empty. The connecting flight left without him. The reason it left without him was that the United States had, in the hours during which Snowden was airborne between Hong Kong and Moscow, revoked his American passport, making it, in the American government's view, invalid for international travel and suggesting that any third country through whose territory he attempted to pass would be obligated to deny him transit on the basis of an invalid travel document. The passport revocation was an extraordinary step. It is not a power the American government exercises routinely, because it raises serious questions about the right of citizens to travel and the government's authority to restrict those rights by administrative action without judicial review. In Snowden's specific case, the United States government was using the revocation not to prevent him from going somewhere exactly, but to make it impossible for him to go anywhere other than where they wanted him to go, which was back to the United States to face charges. The theory was that with an invalid passport, no country would allow him entry and he would be compelled to return. The practical result was that he was trapped in an international airport in a country he had not intended to stay in, carrying a document that the country that had issued it was now refusing to honor, with nowhere to go. He was in the transit zone at Sheremetyevo, the liminal space of an international airport that technically, in the legal architecture of border control, is not yet inside the country it sits in. He had not passed through Russian customs or immigration. He was, in an almost absurdly literal sense, outside the jurisdiction of any country. His country of citizenship had revoked his travel documents, the country whose territory he was physically present in had not admitted him, and every country he might attempt to fly to was under American pressure to deny him transit. He was stateless in an airport in Moscow, and the world's most powerful government was explaining to journalists that it expected him to return home for prosecution. The weeks that followed in the Sheremetyevo transit zone became their own peculiar chapter in a story that had already moved well beyond the conventional categories of either espionage case or journalistic source protection. Snowden was living in the airport, sleeping there, eating there, meeting with journalists and lawyers there. His physical existence reduced to the carpeted corridors and fluorescent lighting of a transit area servicing one of the busiest air routes in the world, while passengers flowing to their connecting flights moved around him and through him with the total indifference of travelers who had their own destinations and their own reasons for being in a Russian airport at various hours of the day and night. He filed asylum requests with 27 countries. The United States contacted every one of them. In country after country, the asylum request was declined with varying degrees of diplomatic regret. Some governments cited legal reasons. Others cited political considerations that amounted to the same thing in different language. Russia, whose government had a complicated set of interests in the Snowden situation that were neither straightforwardly sympathetic nor straightforwardly hostile, maintained a public position of bureaucratic neutrality while showing no inclination to assist the United States in the extradition effort the Americans were pushing for. The incident that most vividly illustrated the diplomatic temperature of those weeks occurred not in Moscow but over the skies of Central Europe. On July 2, 2013, the presidential aircraft of Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, was flying back toward La Paz from Moscow, where Morales had attended a conference. Multiple European countries, France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, simultaneously denied his aircraft permission to enter their airspace, on the basis of a belief, later established to be incorrect, that Snowden was on board. The Bolivian presidential plane was forced to divert to Vienna, where it sat on the tarmac for 14 hours. Morales was effectively detained, an unprecedented diplomatic incident that involved the forced landing of a head of state's aircraft on the basis of a request from the United States government that was grounded in a suspicion that proved unfounded. The reaction across Latin America was a fury of precisely the kind that the United States had been hoping to avoid. Multiple countries issued formal protests. The notion that European governments had effectively stopped a South American president's aircraft to serve American counterintelligence interests concentrated, in a single dramatic image, The diplomatic consequences that the Snowden affair was producing for the United States in its relationships with countries that were not its adversaries but were increasingly discovering that American power could be deployed against their sovereignty as readily as against anyone else's. For Snowden, still in the Sheremetyevo transit zone, the incident sharpened considerably the question of which country was actually going to take him, because the Morales affair made clear that proximity to the United States was not, for most governments, an obstacle their willingness to absorb in his service. 40 days after his arrival at Sheremetyevo, the answer came. Russia would grant him temporary asylum. The man who handed Edward Snowden his Russian asylum documents on August 1, 2013 was a lawyer named Anatoly Kucherina. Kucherina was not simply a practicing attorney in the conventional sense. He had connections to Russian power that were visible and well documented, including a seat on the Public Council of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, Russia's domestic intelligence and security agency, and the institutional successor to the KGB. His involvement in the Snowden case was, in the view of many analysts and former intelligence officers who commented on it, not an accidental encounter between a stranded American and a sympathetic lawyer. It was, rather, the visible surface of a Russian government decision that had been made at a considerably higher level than the attorney-client relationship would suggest. Vladimir Putin's government had been navigating the Snowden situation with the particular combination of formal proceduralism and barely concealed satisfaction that characterized Russian diplomacy in episodes where the United States was in a position of obvious discomfort. Russia had, for over a decade, been on the receiving end of sustained American lectures about democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law, lectures that arrived with a predictability and a consistency that the Kremlin found grating, and which were now, from Moscow's vantage point, somewhat complicated by the documentation that an American intelligence contractor had just presented to the world of the American government's surveillance of its own citizens. Putin, when asked about Snowden at public appearances, had maintained a public posture of official neutrality punctuated by observations about the irony of the situation that were technically restrained and transparently satisfied. The official Russian position was that Snowden had arrived in Russia without planning to stay, that he had been trapped by the revocation of his passport, and that Russia was simply responding to a humanitarian situation created by the American government's own actions. Snowden had, Russia's foreign ministry noted, not violated any Russian law. He had arrived on a valid international travel document, even if that document had subsequently been revoked. He was entitled to request asylum under international law. Russia was granting that request. The American government's position was that Russia was actively sheltering a stolen government property and a criminal fugitive, that the decision to grant asylum constituted a hostile act, and that the bilateral relationship would bear the consequences. Obama canceled a planned summit meeting with Putin, the kind of diplomatic signal that is understood in both capitals as expressing a degree of displeasure that falls short of crisis but well above routine annoyance. The administration said it was deeply disappointed. Russian officials said, in terms that were somewhat more direct than standard diplomatic formulation required, that they were not particularly concerned about American disappointment. For Snowden himself, the asylum meant something more immediate and more personal than the geopolitical dimensions of the exchange in which he had become an involuntary instrument. It meant he could leave the airport. After 40 days in the Sheremetyevo transit zone, 40 days of fluorescent light, airport food, the continuous ambient sound of a major international hub, sleeping in whatever space was available, meeting lawyers and journalists and officials in corridors and waiting areas that were designed for transit and not for residents. He walked out of the airport on August 1, 2013, and entered Russia. Sarah Harrison, who had stayed with him throughout the transit zone period, remained in Russia long enough to ensure he was settled, then left. She could not herself return to the United Kingdom without risk of prosecution under British terrorism statutes that had been applied to others involved in the WikiLeaks ecosystem, so she relocated temporarily to Germany, where she remained for some time before other arrangements became possible. Snowden settled in Moscow. The details of his initial housing arrangements were not made public for security reasons, which is standard for someone in his situation, but it became known over subsequent months that he was living in the city in circumstances that were modest by the standards of his former American salary but entirely functional. He was a free man in a practical sense. able to move around the city, to work, to communicate, though subject, as everyone in Russia is subject, to the awareness that the government of the country in which he was living had its own interests in his presence and its own calculation about how those interests were best served. His security situation was, of necessity, a preoccupation. The American intelligence community had every reason to be intensely interested in what he was doing, with whom he was communicating, and whether any of the documents he had not provided to the journalists might be accessible through him. He was assiduous, according to every account available, about operational security, encrypted communications, careful management of his digital footprint, limited public statements through controlled channels. He gave occasional interviews by video link from Moscow to journalists and human rights organizations and public forums, and these became the primary visible record of his existence in Russia in those first years. Meanwhile, the publications were continuing. The revelations from the Snowden documents were not contained in the first week's wave of stories. They unfolded over months and, in certain respects, years, each new batch of documents opening another dimension of the surveillance landscape, involving different agencies, different programs, different allied countries' intelligence services, and different categories of target. The German magazine Der Spiegel had received portions of the material and was publishing stories about NSA operations in Germany and against German governmental communications. The Brazilian newspaper O Globo was publishing material about NSA surveillance in Brazil. The Guardian and the Washington Post continued their own publication programs. In October of 2013, a story appeared that would, more than any previous disclosure, force the diplomatic consequences of the surveillance programs into the open in a way that could not be managed or minimized. The NSA had been monitoring the mobile phone of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. Merkel, who had grown up in East Germany and had first-hand personal experience of life under the surveillance state of the Stasi. The East German secret police, whose system of informants and file-keeping was one of the most comprehensive domestic surveillance operations in modern history, was reported to have reacted with a personal fury that cut through the professional diplomatic language that political leaders are usually careful to maintain. She called President Obama. The conversation, by the account of people familiar with it, was not comfortable. She subsequently said, publicly, that among friends such behavior was not acceptable, and then said it again in French to the French foreign minister who was dealing with the parallel revelation that the NSA had collected tens of millions of French communications intercepts. The breadth of what was emerging from the documents produced a particular kind of diplomatic damage for the United States because it complicated not merely the relationships with adversaries, where surveillance was expected and accepted as a feature of the competition, but the relationships with allies who had been operating on the assumption that partnership with the United States did not extend to having their leaders' personal communications monitored. The mechanisms of trust underpin the practical functioning of alliances, and trust, once demonstrably misplaced, is not rapidly recoverable through explanation or assurance. The American government said it was reviewing its surveillance practices. It said it placed great value on its relationships with allied governments. It said various things in various settings with varying degrees of specificity about what it would actually change. The allied governments made the appropriate diplomatic noises about accepting the assurances and moving forward. The underlying question of what surveillance the United States was actually conducting against its allies did not go away, partly because the documents were still being published, and partly because the governments involved were not prepared to accept assurances on faith in the way they might have before the summer of 2013. The broader public reckoning was also developing during these months, in parallel to the diplomatic story and the continuing publications. In Congress, members who had been briefed on the programs and had not objected to them publicly were now in the position of having to explain to constituents who were angry about what they had read why the oversight system that was supposed to prevent this kind of outcome had apparently not done so. In universities and research institutions, cryptographers and information security specialists who had been aware for years of the general direction of NSA capabilities but had not known the specific details were absorbing the implications of programs like Muscular, the program that tapped the private fiber optic links between Google and Yahoo's data centers, with a professional horror that produced, in the following months and years, a significant acceleration of work on encryption and secure communications protocols that the NSA's own surveillance model had assumed would not be widely deployed. And in technology companies, the people who ran the platforms through which most of the world's digital communications traveled were confronting a business reality as well as a civic one. They had products whose fundamental value proposition was the trustworthiness of the communication medium they provided, and a story was now unfolding week by week in the newspapers demonstrating, in their company's own names, the specific ways in which that trustworthiness had been compromised. The response would take years to fully develop, but its direction was set in those months of 2013, toward stronger encryption, toward more explicit confrontation with government data requests, toward transparency reports that detailed the volume and nature of requests received. None of this was purely altruistic. The business case for reassuring users was clear and pressing, but the cumulative effect was a genuine and lasting shift in how the technology sector understood its relationship to government surveillance. The legal machinery of the United States government's response to Edward Snowden activated with a completeness and a speed that reflected both the seriousness with which the administration regarded the disclosures and the existing infrastructure for prosecuting exactly this category of offense. The indictment, filed in the Eastern District of Virginia on June 14, 2013, 5 days after Snowden identified himself in the Guardian video, charged him on 3 counts: theft of government property under 18 U.S.C. 641, unauthorized communication of national defense information under the Espionage Act of 1917, and willful communication of classified intelligence information to an unauthorized person under the Espionage Act. The combined potential sentences were significant. Each count carried a maximum of 10 years, giving the indictment a theoretical ceiling of 30 years of federal imprisonment. The Espionage Act was the same statute under which Thomas Drake had been prosecuted. It was a law enacted during the First World War to address spies and saboteurs, and its application to the disclosure of classified information to journalists, rather than to foreign powers, had been controversial since at least the Pentagon Papers case in 1971. The statute's language was broad enough that it had long been read by civil libertarians and press freedom advocates as incompatible with a functioning free press, since its plain text did not distinguish between someone selling secrets to an adversary government for money and someone providing documents to a journalist in the belief that public knowledge of the information would serve the democratic process. The government's position was that these were legally the same offense. Snowden's position, stated consistently in interviews from Moscow over the years that followed, was that the law under which he was charged offered no mechanism for him to present his motivations to a jury, that the Espionage Act, at least as interpreted by the courts, did not permit a public interest defense, meaning that a jury would be instructed not to consider why he had disclosed the information, only whether he had disclosed it. This was not a trivial legal objection. The principle that a defendant can present to a jury the reasons for their actions, and that a jury can acquit even when the technical elements of an offense are met if it concludes the action was morally justified, is fundamental to how criminal law is understood to operate in democratic societies. The application of a statute that stripped this principle from a case in which the defendant's motives were central to the public's understanding of what had happened created a proceeding in which, Snowden said, he could not get a fair trial, not because the courts were corrupted, but because the law itself, as interpreted, precluded a jury from hearing the argument he would have made. His defenders said this was a correct legal analysis. His critics said it was a convenient one, and that the test of whether someone has committed a crime is not whether they are prepared to face the legal consequences of their actions. The legal proceedings that the Snowden disclosures catalyzed operated on a different track from the criminal case against Snowden himself. Within days of the first publications, civil liberties organizations and privacy advocates were filing lawsuits challenging the surveillance programs that had been publicly confirmed. The American Civil Liberties Union filed its challenge to the Section 215 bulk metadata collection program in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York in June 2013, and the eventual outcome of that case and its successors would take years to fully develop but would ultimately produce one of the most significant judicial rulings of the entire episode. In December of 2013, a federal district court judge named Richard Leon, sitting in Washington, issued a ruling in a case called Clayman v. Obama that found the NSA's bulk collection of phone metadata was likely unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures. Leon issued a preliminary injunction against the program, though he stayed the injunction pending appeal, and wrote that he had significant doubts that the Supreme Court's 1979 ruling in Smith v. Maryland, which had established the third-party doctrine under which the government claimed the metadata program was legal, would be applied the same way today. A government that could collect the telephony metadata of all Americans and store it indefinitely, Leon wrote, was engaged in an almost Orwellian undertaking that the framers of the Constitution would not have recognized as consistent with the Fourth Amendment's protections. A second federal judge reached the opposite conclusion 11 days later, setting up exactly the kind of circuit conflict that historically drives cases toward the Supreme Court. The legal battle would proceed in stages over the following years, with different courts reaching different conclusions and the surveillance programs continuing to operate while the litigation was resolved. Within Congress, the revelations had produced a reaction that ranged from fury at Snowden personally to genuine concern about whether the oversight system had failed. Senator Ron Wyden, whose cryptic public warnings about surveillance in the preceding years now appeared to have been exactly as specific as they could be under classification constraints, said the revelations confirmed everything he had been trying to signal. Senator Patrick Leahy, the Judiciary Committee chairman, said the bulk collection program went far beyond what was necessary or appropriate and needed fundamental revision. Representative Jim Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, who had co-authored the original Patriot Act and whose name was on the statute that purportedly authorized Section 215 collection, said publicly that the NSA had misused and misinterpreted the law's intent, and that the bulk collection program was not what Congress had authorized, that the word relevant in the statute had been interpreted to mean essentially everything, which was not a reasonable reading of the term as legislators had intended. The legislative response took 2 years to materialize in a form sufficient to actually change the law. The USA Freedom Act, the Freedom of Information Rights Against Eavesdropping, Dragnet Collection, and Online Monitoring Act, the acronym constructed with evident effort, was signed into law by President Obama on June 2, 2015. The act ended the NSA's authority to conduct bulk collection of telephone metadata under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. The practical effect was to require the NSA to obtain a specific court order targeting specific selection criteria before accessing phone metadata, and to end the practice of storing that metadata in NSA databases. Instead, the records would remain with the telephone companies, subject to targeted query under court authorization. The intelligence community described this as a significant operational constraint. Civil liberties advocates described it as a meaningful but incomplete reform. Both assessments contain truth. The NSA could no longer simply collect everyone's phone records and store them. It could, under the new framework, seek court authorization to query phone companies' own records when conducting investigations. The underlying capability for targeted collection, authorized by a court order, remained. The bulk, suspicionless collection of the entire population's calling patterns did not. Whether this represented a fundamental change in the surveillance state or a marginal adjustment at its edges depended on which aspect of the architecture you were examining. The technology industry's response to the revelations was broader and more lasting than any single piece of legislation. Companies that had been compelled to satisfy NSA requests through PRISM orders that they could not discuss publicly were now, in a changed legal and commercial environment, actively competing to position themselves as champions of user privacy against government overreach. Google announced expanded use of HTTPS encryption across its services. Yahoo moved toward default encryption of data moving between its data centers. Facebook announced a similar shift, specifically in response to the Muscular program that had revealed Google and Yahoo data center to data center traffic to be vulnerable. Apple announced in 2014 that the new version of iOS would use encryption that the company itself could not break, meaning that law enforcement requests for access to data on a locked iPhone could not be satisfied even with Apple's cooperation, because Apple would not have the keys. The director of the FBI, James Comey, called this development deeply troubling and said it created a problem he called going dark. The prospect of digital spaces that law enforcement and intelligence agencies simply could not reach regardless of legal authority. The debate between security agencies wanting access and technology companies building products that precluded that access would continue, with increasing technical elaboration, for years beyond 2015. The international legislative response was also significant, particularly in Europe, where the disclosures had landed with a force amplified by the proximity to the Cold War surveillance history that still informed European political culture. The European Parliament passed a resolution calling for suspension of the Safe Harbor Data Transfer Agreement between the European Union and the United States, an agreement that governed the transfer of European citizens' personal data to American companies, on the grounds that the PRISM revelations had demonstrated the agreement's protections to be inadequate. The eventual collapse of the Safe Harbor Agreement, struck down by the Court of Justice of the European Union in 2015, was a direct downstream consequence of the Snowden revelations, and it took years of diplomatic and legal negotiation to produce a successor framework that Europe would accept. Edward Snowden watched all of this from Moscow. He read the coverage, participated in interviews, spoke at conferences by video link, and continued to advocate, from a distance that was both geographical and institutional, for the changes he had believed necessary when he was sitting in the Hawaii Regional Operations Center with classified documents on his screen and a decision assembling itself in his mind. Whether those changes were adequate, whether what he had paid for what was achieved was in any proportion justified, were questions whose answers varied depending enormously on who you asked. The question that would not settle, amid all the legislative debates and the diplomatic incidents and the legal filings and the technology company announcements, was the one that the Snowden disclosures had placed at the center of a conversation that modernity had been avoiding. What, precisely, was the right relationship between the security of a state and the privacy of the people that state governed, and who was entitled to decide? This was not, strictly speaking, a new question. It was as old as organized government and as particular as the digital century that had arrived and reshaped it. The framers of the Constitution had encountered a version of it in the form of general warrants. Documents issued by British colonial authorities that permitted searches of a person's home and papers without specifying the object of the search, unlimited in duration, requiring no showing of probable cause that a specific crime had been committed and a specific place held evidence of it. The Fourth Amendment was, in part, a direct response to that experience, a constitutional guarantee that searches and seizures would require a warrant, issued upon probable cause, specifically describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The principle embedded in that language was that blanket, undifferentiated surveillance of the population was incompatible with the kind of government the founders were trying to build. 2.5 centuries of technology had intervened between that principle and the program Snowden had documented. The technical infrastructure that made bulk collection possible, the fiber optic cables carrying billions of communications, the server farms storing exabytes of data, the computational power to process it, the algorithms to sort and analyze it, had not existed when the Fourth Amendment was drafted, and the courts that interpreted it had spent decades struggling to apply a constitutional framework designed for physical searches of physical spaces to a world in which the most sensitive information about a person's life, associations, beliefs, and activities was stored in digital form, transmitted through infrastructure owned by private companies, subject to collection by agencies operating under legal authority that was itself classified and reviewed by a court that heard only one side of every argument it adjudicated. The debate had proceeded for years in a context of decisive informational imbalance, because the people arguing that the programs were necessary and proportionate, the intelligence officials, the administration lawyers, the national security professionals, had access to the classified details of what was being done and why, while the people arguing that the programs were excessive and unconstitutional, the civil liberties advocates, the journalists, the legal academics were working from inferences and generalities and the occasional declassified document that confirmed a fraction of their suspicions. The Snowden revelations had eliminated that asymmetry with considerable violence. Both sides of the debate now had the same documents. The argument would have to proceed on its merits. The President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies, which Obama commissioned in August 2013 in response to the political pressure generated by the disclosures, reported back in December of that year with 46 recommendations, many of them significant. The group recommended ending the bulk collection of phone metadata by the NSA, instead requiring targeted court orders served on phone companies. It recommended new restrictions on the use of collected data, new transparency requirements, and an end to certain surveillance programs targeting allied nations' leaders. Not all of its recommendations were implemented, and some were implemented in limited or transformed form, but the document represented an official acknowledgement at the highest level that what had been exposed was genuinely problematic, that the system had expanded beyond the point where its overseers, even those charged with oversight, had full visibility into what it was doing. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, an independent executive branch agency with oversight responsibility for counterterrorism programs, issued its own report on the Section 215 phone metadata program in January 2014. Its conclusion was direct. The program was illegal. The statutory authority under which it operated, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, did not actually authorize bulk collection of the type being conducted. The program should end. The board's report was significant partly because of its content and partly because of what it represented. An oversight body, functioning through official channels, reaching the conclusion that Snowden had arrived at through months of reading classified documents. The difference was that the oversight board could say it publicly and continue to exist as a functioning institution. Snowden had known in advance that the same conclusion reached by an individual acting outside those channels would produce a very different institutional response. The court proceedings that had been initiated in the wake of the disclosures produced their own landmark contributions to the legal record. In May 2015, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, a federal appellate court with jurisdiction over New York, Connecticut, and Vermont, and one of the most significant courts in the American system, ruled in the ACLU's case against the NSA phone metadata program. The Second Circuit's ruling did not reach the constitutional question, instead finding that the program was illegal on purely statutory grounds, that Section 215 did not authorize it. This was, in its practical significance, equivalent in outcome to a constitutional ruling, since it meant the program lacked legal authority, but it was more modest in scope because a statutory problem can be fixed by legislation, while a constitutional problem cannot. The ruling arrived 14 days before the expiration of Section 215, adding urgency to Congress's deliberations about the USA Freedom Act that replaced it. In August 2020, a different federal appellate court reached a conclusion that the passage of years had only sharpened. The Ninth Circuit, in a case called United States v. Mullen, ruled that the NSA phone surveillance program exposed by Snowden had been illegal, and that its illegality had been relevant to the prosecution of a man convicted of sending money to Somalia. The ruling was significant for multiple reasons. It was the first time a federal appellate court had directly ruled on the program's legality after examining the evidence. It confirmed, in a published legal opinion that is part of the permanent record of American law, that the program, which the government had described for years as lawful, necessary, and subject to rigorous oversight, was in fact none of the first and, as the record reflected, considerably less than claimed of the other two. 7 years after a young man in a hotel room in Hong Kong gave classified documents to journalists, a federal court confirmed, in an opinion that will require citation in law school classrooms for as long as the Fourth Amendment exists as a functioning constraint, that what he had been saying about those programs was correct. The broader debate about surveillance continued, of course. It continues today, and will continue for as long as the technical capability to conduct surveillance at scale exists and the institutions with access to that capability have interests in understanding what people are doing and saying. The specific programs that Snowden exposed have been modified, constrained, and in some cases replaced, but the underlying infrastructure, the fundamental orientation of the NSA toward mass collection as a primary intelligence methodology, and the legal architecture that permits extraordinarily broad surveillance under classified court authorization, remain. They have been somewhat more constrained than they were in 2012. They have been rendered somewhat more transparent than they were in 2013. The gap between what the American government was telling its citizens about its surveillance activities and what it was actually doing has been significantly reduced. Whether it has been eliminated is a question that cannot be answered from outside the classification system, which is, in its own way, the most honest summary of where the debate landed. Snowden himself continued to participate in that debate from Moscow in every way available to someone living under conditions of involuntary exile. He gave interviews by secure video link. He spoke at conferences, his image projected on screens in auditoriums in countries he was not permitted to enter. He spoke at universities, to journalism schools, to technology groups, to civil liberties organizations, to the United Nations. He appeared with a frequency that suggested the topic had not exhausted its ability to produce audience interest in documentary films and long-form journalistic profiles and podcast conversations. He maintained a public presence that the American government's characterization of him as a traitor who had damaged national security could never quite fully contain, partly because the legal proceedings that might have adjudicated that characterization had never occurred, and partly because the evidence that continued to emerge from the cases and commissions and review processes conducted in the wake of his disclosures kept complicating the simple story of the malicious leaker. There is a life inside the story, and it is easy to lose track of it amid the programs and the statutes and the court opinions and the diplomatic incidents. But it is the part that persists when the legal details have faded from specific memory. The life of a person who made a choice and lived in the consequences of it, in a foreign city, in a language not his own, in a country governed by a man who was, by any honest accounting, not a champion of the values Snowden had taken the risks he took to defend. The irony of Snowden's Russian exile was one that his critics pointed to with considerable consistency, and that he himself addressed in every thoughtful interview he gave. He had taken enormous personal risk to expose the surveillance overreach of a democratic government whose institutions he had served and whose founding documents he revered. He was living as a consequence in a country governed by an authoritarian regime with surveillance capabilities directed at its own population that made the NSA's programs look modest by comparison. A country whose security services had a documented record of poisoning dissidents on foreign soil, imprisoning journalists, and conducting influence operations against democratic institutions in the very countries that had been most sympathetic to Snowden's cause. The juxtaposition was, as Snowden acknowledged, genuinely uncomfortable. He did not choose Russia. Russia was where circumstances left him when the American government revoked his passport over the Atlantic Ocean. But he was still there, not a prisoner of Russia exactly, but not free to leave it either, because leaving it meant going somewhere the American government could reach him, and the American government had made clear it wanted very much to do exactly that. Lindsay Mills, the woman who had been at their home in Oahu when Snowden's plane took off for Hong Kong, had absorbed the revelation of what her partner had done with what appears, from the outside, to have been a complexity of reaction that public accounts could only partially document. She had maintained a public social media presence in the days after the disclosures that showed a person processing profound disruption. Posts suggesting confusion and pain and the particular quality of hurt that comes from being the last to know about something vast that was happening in the life of someone you shared a home with. In the months that followed, she joined Snowden in Moscow. They were married there in 2017. They have a son, born in Russia. She has said, in the limited public comments she has made about living in Moscow, that it is a real life, an actual life, with all the dimensions that real lives contain and none of the dramatic simplicity that outside observers tend to want to project onto it. It is the life that the decision produced, and they are living it. In 2019, Snowden published a memoir. He called it Permanent Record, a phrase with meaning in the specific context of an intelligence community where documents retain their classification indefinitely, their existence encoded in the databases of agencies that do not forget. The book sold extremely well and was reviewed across the range of positions that had characterized the public conversation about him since June 2013. The American government filed a lawsuit against him seeking the profits from the book's publication, arguing that Snowden had violated the terms of the non-disclosure agreements he had signed with the NSA and the CIA by publishing without prior review. Snowden had no obligation, his lawyers argued, to submit a memoir to the agencies whose activities the memoir described. The legal dispute was ongoing. The American government prevailed in a decision in 2020, with a federal court ruling that the profits from the memoir were owed to the government because of the NDA violations. The ruling did not address the question of Snowden's return to the United States or the criminal charges against him, which remained outstanding. In September 2022, Vladimir Putin signed a decree granting Edward Snowden Russian citizenship. It was, in the coverage it received, treated as a further closing of the door, a formalization of the exile that had been practically permanent since 2013. Putin's spokesperson noted that the citizenship did not prevent Snowden from being extradited to the United States if such extradition were ever to be considered on Russia's part, a carefully constructed statement that managed to be simultaneously reassuring and entirely non-binding. Snowden, who had previously been a permanent resident of Russia under annually renewed residence permits, was now a citizen. He was also still under American indictment on Espionage Act charges. He was a citizen of two countries, able to return to neither of them on terms that would leave him free. The traitor versus whistleblower debate never fully resolved, and the fact that it did not is, in its own way, informative. In cases where the historical verdict is clear, the ambivalence tends to resolve over time. The passage of years builds consensus around what actually happened and what it meant. The continued genuine disagreement about Snowden, more than a decade after the original disclosures, reflects real substantive disagreement about things that are actually contested, about the appropriate balance between security and privacy, about the role of secrecy in democratic governance, about the obligations of people who discover institutional wrongdoing and the methods they are entitled to employ when formal channels are compromised, about whether the public interest value of any given disclosure can be weighed against its potential harm to intelligence operations and, through those operations, to the security of people who depend on them. These are not questions with clean answers, and Snowden himself, in the memoir, in interviews, in the careful and sometimes conflicted ways he has discussed his own actions publicly, has never pretended they are. He has maintained that what he did was right and necessary, but he has also acknowledged, with a consistency that distinguishes his self-presentation from the more self-congratulatory versions of his story that supporters sometimes offered, that what he did caused harm as well as good, that the determination of whether the balance favored the former or the latter was genuinely difficult, and that he would take responsibility for having made the judgment call even while disputing the legal framework that made the consequences of that judgment call as absolute as they have been. The people whose intelligence operations were affected have their own accounting, and it is not generous. Former NSA Director Keith Alexander said publicly that Snowden's disclosures caused the greatest damage to American intelligence capabilities in American history. Former CIA Director John Brennan said Snowden had blood on his hands, a characterization disputed by Snowden's defenders as unsubstantiated and unsupported by any publicly documented case. The question of whether any specific intelligence source was burned or any specific operation was compromised as a result of the Snowden disclosures has never been definitively resolved in the public record, partly because any honest accounting of specific damage would itself require disclosure of classified information, and partly because the intelligence community's damage assessments were themselves classified. What is documented in the public record beyond reasonable dispute is this. The United States government was conducting surveillance of its own citizens and of allied nations on a scale it was systematically concealing from the public and misrepresenting to Congress. Those programs were found, by multiple independent oversight bodies and multiple federal courts, to have exceeded the legal authority under which they were conducted. The public knowledge of their existence, produced by Snowden's disclosures, generated legislative reforms, judicial review, and technical changes in the broader Internet ecosystem that had not been achievable through any other mechanism that had been tried. And a man who had believed in the institutions of his country enough to enlist to fight for them, to spend a decade maintaining their most sensitive secrets, to carry their clearances and serve their operational requirements, had concluded that the only way to hold those institutions to the promises they had made to the people they governed was to break the law that the institutions themselves were breaking. Whether that calculation was correct is a judgment that each person must make for themselves, with the full weight of the evidence available, evidence that exists in significant part because Edward Snowden decided that the evidence needed to exist. There is a photograph that circulated widely in the months after the disclosures, taken by Laura Poitras in the Mira Hotel during those sessions in Hong Kong when everything was still preliminary and unfinished. In it, Snowden sits at a desk in a hotel room with the particular quality of concentrated stillness that characterized how people who were present with him in those days described his presence. He is 30 years old. He looks younger, in a way that the wire-rimmed glasses and the slight thinness of his face contribute to. He looks like someone working on something he finds genuinely difficult and genuinely important, because that is what he was. The photograph captures nothing dramatic. There is no moment of crisis in it, no visible evidence of the weight of what he was carrying. There is a young man at a desk in a hotel room that could be any hotel room in a city that could, from that angle, be any city doing what appears from the outside to be ordinary work. The extraordinary fact is entirely internal to the frame. This is, in a way, the most accurate image of the whole story, the most consequential surveillance breach in American intelligence history conducted at a desk in an ordinary room by a person who looked, at the moment of its execution, entirely unremarkable. The world that Snowden's disclosures encountered has not remained static in the decade-plus since June 2013. The surveillance technologies available to governments have become more capable, not less, in the years since the programs he documented were revealed and partially constrained. Artificial intelligence tools capable of analyzing collected data at scales and speeds that were not practically deployable in 2013 are now part of the intelligence infrastructure of multiple countries. Facial recognition systems operating on public cameras have been deployed in cities around the world at densities that make the geographic tracking implied by telephone metadata seem almost quaint. The surveillance hardware embedded in the mobile devices that essentially every person in a developed country carries has expanded in both sophistication and in the regulatory vulnerability of the data it generates. The fight that Snowden's disclosures made visible was not a fight that his disclosures concluded. It was a fight that his disclosures clarified, organized, and moved to a new stage. The legal architecture that governs digital surveillance in the United States has been partially reformed in ways that wouldn't have been achievable without the documentary evidence the Snowden disclosures provided. The technical architecture of the Internet has been substantially reoriented toward encryption in ways that had not been undertaken at the commercial scale the Snowden revelations motivated. The public understanding of what surveillance infrastructure exists and what it is capable of is immeasurably more sophisticated than it was before the summer of 2013, when most people who were not specifically expert in the field understood the NSA to be an agency that collected foreign signals intelligence, rather than an agency managing a domestic surveillance system of the breadth those first documents described. These things matter. The conversation is different because of them. Policy is different. Technology is different. The standard of proof the government is required to meet before a court will authorize the specific variety of collection that Snowden documented is, in important respects, higher than it was in 2012. Whether these changes are enough depends on what you think enough means in the context of a government that continues to maintain, under less comprehensive but still substantial authority, a surveillance presence in the digital lives of its citizens and of much of the world's population. The programs revealed in 2013 were specific deployments of a broader capacity, and the broader capacity remains. The PRISM program, as modified by subsequent reforms and the expiration and renewal of the legal authorities supporting it, continues to operate in a form whose details are classified. The capability to conduct the kind of analysis that Xkeyscore represented has not been abandoned. It has been updated. The fiber optic network that Muscular tapped still carries the world's data, and the interest of intelligence agencies in what flows through it has not diminished because a contractor in Hawaii read the relevant documents in 2012 and decided the public needed to know about them. The argument that Snowden's most consistent critics have made, that his disclosures made serious surveillance reform less rather than more achievable, by producing a political backlash that allowed the intelligence community to frame all oversight efforts as capitulation to leakers and foreign adversaries, has not been borne out by what actually happened. The reforms that followed, however incomplete, were real. The legal rulings that declared the programs illegal were real. The changes in how technology companies build and deploy their products were real. The parliamentary debates in Europe, the legislative reforms in Australia and Canada, the UN resolutions on digital privacy, all of these were catalyzed by knowledge that would not exist without the disclosures. The case that the disclosures were net harmful requires discounting all of this while crediting a speculative proposition that better reforms would have come through channels that had, for the previous decade, produced nothing. The criminal charges against Snowden remain. He remains in Russia. The Espionage Act indictment is not a document with an expiration date, and successive American administrations have shown no inclination to move toward either prosecution, which would require Snowden's presence in an American courtroom, which he could not provide without also providing his own imprisonment, since no American president has offered him immunity or a plea arrangement that would involve a public interest defense, or pardon, which would require a president prepared to absorb the political cost of appearing to validate the characterization of Snowden as someone who did something right. Various civil liberties advocates, former intelligence officials who have reviewed the totality of the record, journalists, and legal scholars have argued for a pardon. Various former intelligence officials, current officials, and members of Congress who prioritize the institutional equities of the agencies Snowden damaged have argued against any accommodation. No pardon has been issued. He gave a speech by video link from Moscow at the 2019 We the People Summit in Washington, carrying in the background of the screen the features of a city he could not physically visit. He spoke without self-pity but with a precise and somewhat wistful recognition of the particular shape his life had taken. He said that he did not regret what he had done, but that he regretted the way it had to be done. The secrecy, the disappearance, the harm to Lindsay, the impossibility of the choice between transparency and personal accountability that the structure of American espionage law had created. He said the government of the United States had, by classifying the legal interpretations it used to justify mass surveillance, made it legally impossible for a citizen to object to those interpretations through legitimate channels, because objecting through legitimate channels required disclosing that classified interpretations existed. He said this was a structural problem that the reforms he had helped catalyze had partially addressed but not resolved. He is right about that. The structural problem persists. Secret court, secret law, secret oversight, applied to a technical infrastructure of collection that operates at a scale and with a reach that the relevant statutes were not designed to govern and that the public, even now, can only partially see. The reforms of 2015 reduced the problem. They did not end it. The court rulings of 2020 documented that the law had been violated. They did not prevent the violation from occurring for the 7 years over which it operated. The transparency reports that technology companies now publish give the public more information about government data demands than existed before 2013. They do not give the public full visibility into what happens under the classified authorities that don't appear in those reports. The permanent record is incomplete. It always is. There are things in the files of the National Security Agency that no journalist has seen, that no oversight body has reviewed, that no court has evaluated. There are programs operating today under authorities and legal interpretations that exist classified in the same institutional architecture that produced PRISM and XKeyscore and the Section 215 bulk collection order. Whether those programs are proportionate, whether their legal foundations are sound, whether the people who are subject to them would consent to that subjection if they understood it, these are questions that cannot be answered from outside the classification system, which is, as it has been since 2007, the whole point. What Edward Snowden gave the world was not answers to these questions. He gave the world the ability to ask them properly, with specific facts, documentary evidence, legal mechanisms, technological responses, and the democratic pressure that informed citizens can only bring when they know what is actually being done in their name. What the world does with that ability, in courts, in legislatures, in voting booths, in the design of the technologies that carry the data of human life, is not decided in any hotel room in Hong Kong or any transit zone in Moscow or any classified facility in Hawaii. It is decided by the people who know the questions exist and choose to engage with them. The permanent record belongs to all of us. The question is what we write in it next.